First Steps into the Night, written by Tao Wong, narrated by Stephanie Németh-Parker. An oval metallic bright red helmet that looked like a bastard cross between science fiction and a motorcycle helmet held the attention of the leggy brunette as it lay on her bed. Kylie Porter bit her lip as she stared at the 𝗃𝗵𝗂𝗁𝗀 virtual reality helmet, forcing herself to draw and exhale a deep breath to calm her nerves. This is your first assignment. Brent, that rat bastard, won't buy the piece if you don't write it. You can't write it if you don't go in. Come on, Kylie. All the studies say it's fine. There's no danger. The brunette whispered to herself in a surprisingly low, husky voice in an effort to psych herself up. The truth was, for Kylie, it was not about the danger to her mind or body that the VR helmet exemplified, but what came afterward. You know Jonathan won't wait long for you. If he doesn't show you around, you don't have a chance at writing this. As she chewed on her lower lip, Kylie looked out of the 11th floor window of her apartment. The downtown skyline of Vancouver still glowed with reflected electric light, even years after the night sky legislation had passed. Beneath her, she could hear the low rumble of electric buses and grid-connected shared vehicles carrying the residents to the latest party. A part of Kylie desperately wanted to be out there, in the press of humanity, rather than in here, staring at the helmet. Then again, she barely had enough money to make it through the month. Existing on the minimum basic income was tough, especially for a single woman without roommates. Kylie sighed and turned away from the window and back to the helmet. She finally forced herself to pick it up, and she slid it over her long, silky hair. As she adjusted the straps, Kylie lay down on the bed before she touched the side of the helmet, engaging the program. A brief moment of disorientation later, and light blossomed around her eyes before it faded away, gray and red titles floating into her vision. Welcome to Eternal Night. Eternity awaits all. Kylie found herself in a cream-colored foyer with no furniture, only a single pedestal. As she walked up to it, she marveled at how real everything felt. The soft caress of the silk dress around her thighs, the clack of her high heels on the marble floor, and the floral notes that tickled her nostrils. It took her a brief moment to realize that it was a touch too realistic, as her small breasts shifted unsupported under her dress. The lack of underclothing an unpleasant surprise. A further, more pleasant surprise appeared in the form of her greeter, Bill Lowry, the debonair and charming silver-haired Englishman who had appeared by the pedestal. Ms. Sugard, Bill said in that deep, rolling voice of his that had made him a favorite celebrity for decades. Welcome to Eternal Night. I will be your guide during the character creation process. From the details of your account, this is your first virtual realm game? Yes, Kylie said. She found herself slightly breathless as she stared up at the older man. She was not too modest to admit that she had a crush on the celebrity, and finding herself in his presence, even a recorded virtual presence, was closer than she had ever expected to get. Very well, then. He smiled at her and waved to the pedestal. If you will put your hand on the pedestal, we need to finish the legal agreements first, after which I will explain the character creation process and guide you through the tutorial. Oh, but I have a friend who is showing me around, Kylie blurted out, her eyes growing wide. How long will this take? A few hours at most, Miss Sugard, Bill rumbled. However, if you wish, we can skip the tutorial aspects for now. You may return to the tutorial at any time while in a safe location. We will still, however, have to complete the legal agreement and character creation. Of course. Relieved, Kylie smiled and placed her hand on the pedestal. In front of her, a long document listing the terms and conditions of the game appeared. Do you wish me to read them to you? Bill offered, and for a moment, Kylie almost agreed. The journalist in her wondered how many women actually did agree. Certainly if anyone could make dry legal text sound exciting, it would be Bill Lowry. No, just let me know how to agree. 𝗁𝗃 replied. As Bill led her through the necessary steps, she settled in to complete the character creation process as quickly as possible. As it stood, she had dithered long enough already. She was afraid she would be late for her appointment. Took you long enough. The wry, sarcastic tone made 𝗁𝗃 jerk slightly as she walked out of the train station. The admiring glance that came a moment later was, at least, more the effect she had hoped for. Character creation had taken longer than she had expected, mostly because she had found herself getting caught up in the avatar creation process. While cyber eunuchs had, at the recommendations of a number of psychologists, restricted the character creation process to similar models to the user's own body, for the most part, it did allow minor modification. It was, in many ways, very similar to the programs that plastic surgeons used, allowing individuals to create a more perfect image of themselves. As such, 𝗁𝗃 had altered certain aspects of her body that she had never liked. Her lips were now plumper, her hair a touch longer, ears smaller, and she now had a chin that was slightly less pointy. She had even added a cup size, though she had decided against the truly voluptuous proportions that were available. All in all, she had to think that she looked good, and the lingering, heated look that Jonathan was offering her was testament to that. "Jonathan," 𝗁𝗃 replied, smirking slightly that he never bothered to change his first name. On the other hand, Jonathan had certainly filled out since she had last seen him half a decade ago. Towering over her at 6'3", black hair and a buzz cut with those deep, dark black eyes of his, Jonathan's avatar had the broad shoulders and tapered waist of a gymnast. "You're looking good." "Thanks. We should get going," Jonathan replied, leading the young lady to a waiting car. He opened the door for her, letting her slide into the back seat before he joined her. A single barked word of "home" had the driver taking off. "I take it you followed my recommendations?" "Yes, all of them, though I'm not sure why you were so specific," 𝗁𝗃 admitted, and Jonathan smiled, that twinkle in his eyes making her think of winter evenings spent over cups of mulled wine, huddled under fur blankets. She blinked, her mouth open in surprise as a memory that was not hers crept into her mind. "First injected memory?" Jonathan asked, and she nodded numbly. Of course, 𝗁𝗃 had read about how cyber eunuchs had created, and some said perfected, the development of artificial memories, but she had always thought it would somehow feel alien to her. This had been much more intuitive, almost as if it had been her own memory. If not for the fact that everything had been in black and white, she would have found it quite difficult to tell the difference. "It seems so real," 𝗁𝗃 said out loud. "It's not really a real memory. It just feels like it. It's more akin to a thought that is slightly fuzzy, which is why it seems so close to a real memory." "It's still strange," Jonathan answered her, smiling slightly before he gestured sideways. "Either way, you'll get used to it." 𝗁𝗃 nodded again, staring out the window before she asked the obvious question. "Where are we going? I thought you said you were going to show me the game." "To feed. Starting characters start with about a quarter of their blood pool, so you have to feed tonight or else you'll fall into a blood frenzy," Jonathan said, lips turning up slightly. "Oh." 𝗁𝗃 fell silent as she contemplated how she would handle drinking blood. Even if it was a game, the entire concept made her a little bit queasy. Her thoughts were interrupted as the car pulled to a stop, marking their arrival in the underground garage. Jonathan offered his hand as he stepped out of the car, guiding 𝗁𝗃 to the elevator and his penthouse apartment. Jonathan opened the door and gestured for 𝗁𝗃 to enter before him. As 𝗁𝗃 strode into the modern, sparsely furnished apartment, she was greeted by a petite Japanese lady with what must have been game-augmented breasts, wearing an extremely tight, strapless gown. "Welcome back, master." The Japanese woman bowed slightly to Jonathan as he entered before she turned to the newcomer. "Welcome. I am Hana Takizawa." Karen Lane," 𝗁𝗃 answered before turning to give Jonathan a reproving look. "Really? A Japanese maid calling you master?" "I am sorry, Ms. Lane," But I am not an NPC, Hana said quickly before Jonathan could reply. She smiled sweetly at 𝗁𝗄𝗃 as she bowed to her again. I am a player character, and I call Jonathan Master, as that is his title. He is my bloodlord. I'd also stop breaking roleplay so blatantly, Jonathan drawled, his lip twisted up on one side. It is considered bad form, especially among those we will be visiting. 𝗁𝗄𝗃 nodded, taking the rebuke in stride. She stared at Hana, who waved them farther into the condo, leading them past the granite countertop kitchen to the living room where a pair of black couches looked out over the city view. Towering high-rises and condo apartments were abound, though few were as tall as the building they currently resided in. Outside, street lamps and office buildings glittered in the dark, telling their tale of lives lived. In the far distance to the left, mountains glittered, while to the right, the Atlantic Ocean lay. As 𝗁𝗃 took in the spectacular view, a hand was placed in the small of her back. When she turned to confront the invader, she found herself staring at Hana, who smiled up at her demurely. They were so close that 𝗁𝗃 could not help but notice Hana's smell, the slight floral note of her perfume, and beneath that, the clean, intoxicating smell of her skin. 𝗁𝗃 found herself reacting to Hana's presence, leaning forward to draw a deeper breath. That bastard, 𝗁𝗃 thought. He knows I have a thing for Asian women. 𝗁𝗃 began. My master informed me of your needs. Please, let me. Hana murmured as she tilted her head to the side and brushed her long hair clear of her neck. You need only let your instincts guide you. 𝗁𝗃 blinked, staring at the long, supple line of flesh before her and the thud of the blood beneath Hana's skin. She could, she swore, almost see it, taste it. Without thought, 𝗁𝗃's fangs extended from her mouth as she bent down, a hand coming up to grasp the young lady by the back of her head, while her other hand grasped Hana's behind, pulling her tight. 𝗁𝗃 breathed in the intoxicating scent that surrounded her now, which made her nipples harden and her body wet. Unable to resist any further, 𝗁𝗃 plunged her head down onto Hana's bared neck. As her fangs pierced Hana's skin, she felt the rush of blood enter her mouth. The blood tasted like hot chocolate, tinged with salty iron. It tasted so good that 𝗁𝗃 moaned slightly in ecstasy, clutching the Japanese woman to her body and melding it to her. Beneath her lips, Hana groaned in pleasure, fists clenched as she was taken. Blood pulsed in her mouth, sending waves of warmth down 𝗁𝗃's body with each mouthful she drank. It set her flesh burning, her nerves tingling with sensation as she drew it all in, her body involuntarily clenching and releasing as she sucked. She was caught for minutes, maybe hours, before insistent tapping on her shoulder finally drew her away from Hana. Enough, Karen, Jonathan said, as he pulled her away from the petite young lady before catching her with one arm, setting her on a nearby couch to rest. Is she okay? 𝗁𝗃 said as she wiped her mouth clean. She was surprised at how little blood there was to clean, but then again, why should she be? After all, this was a game, and no one really wanted to spend their game time cleaning up messy blood spillages. She will be fine. You took a little too much, but Hana will recover in a few days, Jonathan replied, smiling down at the young Japanese girl fondly. We can leave her here. You need to get changed. Oh, 𝗁𝗃 nodded and then stopped. Changed? Huh. Jonathan pointed, and to the side, hung up on the nearby mantel, was a long, shimmering gown, very similar to the one that she first started the game with in the training area. Best hurry. We don't want to be late. Dressed and her hair redone, 𝗁𝗃 found herself sharing the elevator down with Jonathan. Able to speak now, she asked the questions that had built up in her. You said a few days. How does that work? How much blood did I drink? Hana's a blood baby. Their skills include faster regeneration, blood scent, taste additions, and related abilities. Jonathan said, "Most players who have a blood baby character have more than one, since a bad feeding can knock your character out for a few days." "Oh," 𝗁𝗘 bit her lip. "Ask it," Jonathan said. "Ask what?" "Whatever it is you're thinking about," Jonathan replied as he stepped out of the elevator. "Why? I mean, why do people play blood babies?" 𝗁𝗘 blurted out as she followed Jonathan to the waiting car. "Depends. However, what you felt while feeding? Blood babies feel it twice, 3 times as intensely. I'm told it's better than sex for many," Jonathan said. "Some people like playing someone subservient. Others do it for the pleasure. And then, of course, there are those who play the long game." "Long game?" 𝗁𝗘 asked. "If you can convince an Eternal with a high blood potency to turn you in-game, you can skip the character creation process and give yourself a significant leg up in terms of power. You get to keep all the skills and abilities you built up after all," Jonathan said. "Oh," 𝗁𝗘 nodded in thanks. "So, this party." "Ball. It's a ball," Jonathan corrected. "The leader of the 𝗃𝗶𝗵𝗁, Caroline, hosts a monthly ball. Everyone who was anyone in Eternal Society shows up. If you want to see what the game is like, there is no better place tonight." "A ball," 𝗁𝗘 said, her voice utterly deadpan. "Yes. Now, be good and remember role play," Jonathan replied, opening the door as they pulled up. As 𝗁𝗘 exited the vehicle, she stared up at the large colonial mansion with its white marble columns and uniformed servants. All around her, primped and pampered individuals walked up the stairs. Most were pale, only a few lightly tanned. She had to smile slightly, remembering that Eternals in the game were able to interact even during the day, allowing players to log in at all hours to continue playing. Of course, since it was a game that focused on the Eternals, the night portions of the game were significantly longer than the day portions. In accordance with the theme, Eternals had significant penalties in the light of the sun, which gave the AI-controlled hunters a chance. A slight elbow in her side made 𝗁𝗘 remember to focus again on the present, as John led her up the stairs. He paused only long enough to nod in greeting to the majordomo at the doors before he led her in, without proffering the invitations many others did. 𝗁𝗘 was not oblivious to the jealous looks that they received for his casual display of status and power from the surrounding Eternals. Eyes wide, she leaned in slightly to whisper, "There are a lot of Eternals here, John." "A decent attendance," John said as he let his eyes wander over the gathering. "It is the monthly ball." 𝗁𝗘 marveled at the decor as John led her into the building. Beautiful white, impeccably polished marble floors were flanked by solid, single-tree wooden doors on each side. An impressively large pair of double doors were directly ahead of her, which opened into the main ballroom itself, though John led her to the right, past those doors and along the corridor to ascend a set of staircases. On the second floor, she was brought to the balcony that oversaw the ballroom to allow her to watch the dancers below. All across the floor, dancers clad in designer ball gowns and tuxedos moved under fully lit chandeliers, while waiters and waitresses walked between them, carrying hors d'oeuvres and glasses of red wine. Other servers with a blue or white armband walked among the throng carrying nothing, while servers clad with a gold armband were found only on this floor. As she watched, 𝗁𝗘 noticed that these servers would occasionally be gently taken to carefully arranged side tables and sheltered nooks where Eternals would feed on them. "What are the colors for, John?" 𝗁𝗘 murmured. There were not enough colors to indicate blood type among the throng, though she noticed that there were a larger number of white scarves than there were of the other two. John stayed silent until a passing server walked by. When she did, John reached out to gently tap the petite blonde on the shoulder, wherein the server stopped immediately, turning to the pair with a smile. "Please turn and show Miss Lane your sigil." Obeying his instructions, the server turned to the left and showcased her white armband as she stepped closer to 𝗁𝗘. On it was a carefully embroidered sigil of a lion flanked by 2 griffins. Unconsciously, Kylie found herself inhaling the scent of the young lady, her expanded senses drinking in the appetizing scent of the woman. His eyes crinkling slightly, John dismissed the server before he spoke to Kylie. Each color represents a different sponsor for this evening's festivities. A slightly raised hand beckoned a tall, olive-complexioned server with a gold armband to them. Even before he closed in on the pair, Kylie could smell the intoxicating scent of the man. She found herself arching her back unconsciously before she swept her hair back from her face. However, before she could reach the man, John stepped in the way and placed a hand on his chest. Kylie hissed in frustration, and her fangs lowered slightly from her lips as she struggled for self-control. As John stood before the man, he craned his neck down as he gently raised the man's chin. He nuzzled the neck before nipping at the exposed skin, taking the slightest sip before he licked the wound clean, sealing it again. The scent of the man's exposed blood almost sent Kylie into a tizzy before she caught herself and pushed her back against the railing. As she forced herself to breathe deeply, Kylie wondered what was happening to her. "And that's why I had you feed before you came," John answered her unspoken question. He watched the young man amble away before he smiled slightly. "Hana tastes better than them anyway." "What?" She shook her head and tried again. "Why do they smell so good?" "Alluring scent. It's a blood perk that blood babies get," John said, keeping his voice soft as he spoke. "He has a few levels in it, as does Hana. However, she has better levels in blood palate." Nodding dumbly, Kylie took a deep breath and focused on her job, analyzing the room. After a moment, she said, "Each of the blood babies is sponsored. I'm assuming a large number, if not all, are AIs, and the white went for quantity while gold went with quality." At her pronouncement, a soft clapping sound caught Kylie's attention. She turned, spotting an elegant blonde with gray eyes and flowing, naturally blonde hair walked up to her in a cross-strapped gown with a daring cutout. "Well done. This is your friend, John?" "Charlotte." John walked over to the approaching lady and took her hand, kissing it gently. "And yes, excuse her lack of decorum. She's new at this. Karen, Charlotte Renard here is your bloodline's elder in this city." "I'll always excuse someone so beautiful," Charlotte said gaily before she sauntered over to lean against the railing next to Kylie. As she rested her arms on the railing, Kylie could not help but notice the gold bracer that she wore had the same sigil engraved on it as the ones on the gold armbands. "And I believe it better befits a host to provide higher quality nourishment." "You would say that, and you would leave everyone hungry," another voice called forth as another blonde, this one less voluptuous and taller, came striding over to the pair. If Charlotte was Marilyn Monroe, this lady was a supermodel, her frame thin with perfect poise. Dressed in a beautiful, form-fitting white gown with the embroidered crest accenting the entire dress. "Will you introduce us, John?" "Of course," John said as he gestured to Kylie. "Karen Lane of the 𝗲𝗏𝗵𝗫, Anna Johnson of the Caesars." Kylie blinked, confused for a moment, before she decided to curtsy to each lady. Thinking fast, she first curtsied to Charlotte and then Anna. A slight smile crossed Charlotte's face, while Anna's eyes grew slightly colder. However, Kylie was relieved to note the slight nod that John gave her for her actions. This seemed like murky and dangerous waters she suddenly found herself in. "Those who are unable to fend for themselves should not be coddled," Charlotte sighed, arching her back slightly and displaying her charms as she continued. "Your generosity only ensures that the rabble keep relying on us." "Better they rely on us and come to these events than cause trouble outside," said Anna. "We are better off with the fingers content with the balls and games we create than them creating their own. And, of course, the fact that they support your little proposals has nothing to do with your actions," Charlotte said. "I don't proclaim charity," Anna snapped. "I leave that for the 𝗪𝗶𝗵𝗁. What I do for the good of the city, which is more than can be said for you." The city is better off with fewer fingers and more bloods, Charlotte said. Kylie watched the byplay between the two, confused. She shot John a look and he smiled slightly, glancing at the ladies. If you ladies do not mind, perhaps I can explain the matter to my friend. Please, maybe your explanation can clear up some confusion others have too, Charlotte said, her voice dripping scorn. Anna snorted but waved John to continue. He nodded agreeably, stepping up to the railing and gesturing down to the throng below who danced. You have to understand, Eternal Night is played by a wide variety of people, like any other game. Players all have their own reasons, of course, but they can be broken down into 3 main types. The casuals, the fingers that you see below. They join us every few days and enjoy the fantasy of being rich, powerful, and beautiful. Then there are the bloods, like Anna and Charlotte, who are much more serious. Bloods hold most of the day-to-day power in the city, and they are the ones who organize many of the balls, the games, and the hunts that keep the fingers entertained. The argument, as you can then guess, is how much bloods should cater to fingers. Jonathan paused slightly before he finally continued. Also, fingers is considered impolite. Most prefer the term eternals. Oh, Kylie said, glancing between the group. Her brow scrunched as she thought. But why hold these events at all? What do bloods get out of it? Power, prestige, influence, Anna answered immediately. Your character probably has significant financial resources at her behest. At these events, you can gain more by interacting with other Eternals. By hosting these events, we bring Eternals together, which allows us to draw power and prestige to ourselves. Caroline sighed, shaking her head. Expect a Caesar to always think about the masses. Better to focus on those that matter. And on that note, I do have work to do. Another time, Jonathan. Ms. Lane, I hope you will continue to play. If you do, make sure to visit me. Anna. Of course, Caroline. Jonathan inclined his head slightly to Caroline, who turned and strode off. Once she'd left, Anna turned to focus on Kylie fully. So, Miss Lane, Jonathan mentioned to us that he would be showing an old friend of his off. Did he, perhaps, introduce you around yet? No, we just arrived. And please, call me Karen, Kylie said, introducing herself, and Anna nodded. Anna, then, Anna smiled. If that is the case, I'll let him continue. Do come speak with me again. When Anna left, Kylie leaned in to whisper to Jonathan, careful to keep her voice low. That was intense. It reminded me of high school. I wouldn't know, John replied, smiling slightly. Kylie recalled then that, unlike her, Jonathan had never been part of the cool kids. He had rather mixed with the outcasts. It was only Jonathan's well-known record in the school's karate tournaments that had ensured that he was never bothered. Right. Kylie fell silent, glancing around. So, is it always like that? Sort of. Taking her hand, Jonathan led her along the floor, nodding to people while never stopping to speak. Eternal Night for the Blood is a game of prestige and influence. If you can get enough people to agree with you, deal with you, then you can win. The skills, the stats, those are all ancillary to the real game of politics. Of course, the stats help since Kovacur's tech makes it easier for those with high stats to convince you in-game. Now, watch the pair of men on your left. They're 𝗙𝗵𝗵𝗁 and 𝗵𝗵𝗁𝗃, and they are putting together a deal to safeguard the 𝗙𝗵𝗵𝗁's latest project. The Caesar hovering in the corner is the financier for it all. In this way, he murmured softly to Kylie as they walked around the room, John pointing out the games of influence and politics being played. A business deal here, promises of protection there, a guarantee of attendance another place. The deals were all varied. The promises seemed to be both tangible and esoteric. A vial of blood, a pair of enchanted swords, millions of dollars. After a time, 𝗁𝗄 caught Jonathan's arm and pulled him to a stop and over to a nearby column where she spoke with him. "It's so complicated. It's like another world." "It very much is," Jonathan replied, smiling slightly. "𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗀's created a very complex economic and city-building game, which allows us to trade and negotiate for anything you can think of. The politics and intrigue in the game among the Bloods comes from that." 𝗁𝗁 slowly nodded. "Something has been bothering me. You said there are 3 kinds, but never mentioned the third." "Ah, the third kind of player are the lifers," Jonathan replied. Well, they're like the Bloods in that they take the game seriously, but mostly because they make their money off the game. There's mixed feelings about them." "Oh, right," 𝗁𝗁 nodded, smiling slightly. 𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗀's exchange was well known and was linked to all their games. It allowed players to purchase 𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗀 dollars, which they could then use to purchase additional resources in any of 𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗀's games or their subsidiary services. To allow players to test and play in all their games, 𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗀 had an internal exchange, which allowed players to trade in-game resources for 𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗀 dollars. However, many players soon realized that it was quite possible to use their 𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗀 dollars to pay for regular day-to-day services, as 𝗃𝗃𝗁𝗀's subsidiaries and affiliates spanned the globe, giving birth to lifers. "Do you want to dance?" John asked as they completed the circuit around the second floor. He could already see that 𝗁𝗁 had been making mental notes of the taste he had given her of the politics of the Blood. "Dance?" "Yes, down there." He inclined his head to the ballroom below. "Oh, I'm a bit out of practice," 𝗁𝗁 admitted. It had been ages since she had danced, and certainly even longer since she had done ballroom. Why, it would be nearly— "Well, you do owe me a dance from prom," Jonathan pointed out as he gently guided her down the stairs. 𝗁𝗁 blushed, remembering how she had promised him that dance for his last-minute help with her science paper. Jonathan never did collect on it, though, having never turned up to prom. "Whatever happened to you?" 𝗁𝗁 murmured as Jonathan smoothly joined the spinning couples, pulling her along. 𝗁𝗁 found herself automatically following his strong lead, her body, assisted by the software, finding the rhythm with ease. "Ah." Jonathan fell silent, his eyes darkening. 𝗁𝗁 opened her mouth to take the question back, but she was surprised to find him answer her. "My dad received a last-minute transfer. We had to be packed and gone in a week." "Oh," 𝗁𝗁 said, smiling slightly. "Well, you're a much better dancer than my date was then." "Perks of the system," Jonathan replied, before he spun 𝗁𝗁 as she got into the flow of the dance. "Having fun?" "Yes," 𝗁𝗁 replied and blinked. Is this supposed to happen?" With careless ease, John switched places with 𝗁𝗁, never missing a beat. He let out a sigh before he smoothly guided his companion off the dance floor without wasting a beat. Free of the dancers, Jonathan strode forward, clearing his throat as he pushed past the gawking audience. Having received no response, Jonathan tapped the man on the shoulder. "That's enough," Jonathan commanded. "I said, that's enough." Having stepped to his side, 𝗁𝗁 saw the brief transformation as it happened. Jonathan's skin grew pale, his eyes glowed red, and his voice filled with power as he spoke. Forced by the power in Jonathan's voice, the blood-lost Eternal finally pulled away from the blood doll he was draining at their feet. "Fuck off," the 𝗃𝗺 hissed at Jonathan as he turned back to the body. "No, you do not kill at a ball," Jonathan said, reaching forwards to grip the man's shoulder. "Let him go." "What do you care? It's just an NPC," the 𝗃𝗺 growled again, attempting to push against Jonathan's hand and failing. He frowned as he pulled to his feet. "Oh, God, you're one of those role-playing freaks." "Not exactly." Jonathan smiled at him, tilting his head to the side. "Now, be a good boy and go with these men." Again, 𝗁𝗁 watched as a wave of power emanated from Jonathan. The 𝗃𝗺 growled, fighting it for a brief moment before he turned and followed the waiting security guards. Another pair of servers swooped in, taking hold of the body of the blood doll and removing it discreetly. "What was that?" Kylie murmured. "Command," Jonathan explained as he guided her away. "You've got that much power?" Kylie said admiringly. "Not exactly. I just have a lot more influence than he has," Jonathan said and waved his hand around. "It's the game's version of a reputation monitor, but with in-game effects on other players. A high influence score adds weight to social skills and gifts." Kylie frowned, biting her lip. "Doesn't that take away from his will?" "Not really," Jonathan said. "He could ignore it if he really wanted to. However, doing so imposes a significant penalty on his own influence score. The game can nudge you, but it can't compel you." Kylie nodded again, and Jonathan smiled, offering his hand again to hers. "Now, where were we?" Kylie shrugged, looking over the dance floor. The allure of the ball had fallen away after the encounter, and she looked at it once again with a critical eye. "So, is this the game then? Snotty barbs, boardroom politics, and quasi-sex?" At her pronouncement, Jonathan paused, quietly regarding her. Finally, he slowly nodded. "For this portion, yes." Okay." Kylie rubbed at her nose, thinking. Muttering to herself, she considered her options. "I can work with that. Maybe play up the sex angle for the article." "Well, we aren't done yet. Since the boardroom politics doesn't interest you, we'll move on." Jonathan smiled, guiding her out of the building. He sighed regretfully, glancing back once as he brought Kylie to the exit. Oblivious to this, Kylie just continued to watch the players all around her. "Where are we going now?" Kylie said. "Like all virtual games, combat is a major draw," Jonathan said, guiding her to the exit. "There's an arena scheduled tonight, so I figured we might get you involved." Combat?" Kylie said, around the sudden lump in her throat. Once again, she had to remind herself that this was just a game. No matter how real it seemed, it was not real life. "Yes," Jonathan replied. Magically, even as they exited, their car was waiting for them. Kylie blinked, staring at the vehicle. Well, she thought after a moment, it was a game. Altering minor things to make it more convenient for the players made sense. No one really wanted to wait for their car to pull up. "Come, we'll need to change," Jonathan said as he entered after her and pulled a slim bag from under the chair. Kylie said, looking around the sparse interior. "I won't look," Jonathan said, turning away to stare out of the window. Kylie blinked, staring at the man before her. She sighed and reached for the bag. It was not as if Jonathan would actually see her real body, even if he did peek. The fact that she felt a slight thrill at the thought of Jonathan peeking was completely beside the fact, she told herself. Inside, Kylie was surprised to find some extremely sensible clothing choices. A sports bra and an athletic top were the underlayer, before a zip-up thin ballistic vest covered her torso. For her bottoms, Jonathan had packed double-lined Kevlar leggings and a pair of sturdy, if stylish, steel-toed boots. For weaponry, she found a pair of knives that attached to a separate belt. Kylie found herself pursing her lips in thought as she squirmed to undo the zipper in her back. Finally giving up, she said, "John, I need your help with the zipper." "Of course." Jonathan turned to her, reaching for the zipper while Kylie pulled her hair aside. He deftly undid the zipper, his fingers brushing along her back as he pulled down. At his touch, Kylie drew in a soft breath, exhaling with regret when he released the dress and turned back to the window. Pushing it aside, Kylie squirmed in the back seat as she dressed, sliding on the clothing with deft movements. It was only when she was mostly dressed that she noticed that the window was just dark enough to have reflected most of what she was doing, if Jonathan had cared to look. Flushing, she opened her mouth to say something, but she was interrupted by Jonathan. "Ready yet? We're nearly there." Kylie nodded dumbly, and then realizing he was still looking away, she said, "Yes." Jonathan turned back, looking her up and down appraisingly. There was no heat in his eyes this time, just critical appreciation before he nodded. As the car drew to a halt, Jonathan stepped out and held out for her. "There's a jacket for you and me in the trunk. I'll need to dress too." When she opened the trunk, Kylie found the aforementioned articles of clothing, a matching pair of black leather jackets. A quick inspection revealed the correct jacket, which Kylie slipped on, hiding the pair of knives. As she came around the car, with Jonathan's jacket on her arm, her eyes widened. Jonathan had taken off his jacket and shirt and was in the process of arming himself with a pair of handguns. "How come I don't get a gun?" Kylie asked as Jonathan slid his jacket on. "Do you know how to shoot?" "Well, no. I didn't see the option of buying that skill either," Kylie added, and Jonathan nodded. "Guns are less useful against Eternals anyway. Better to use a knife. If you stick around, I'll make sure to give you a few lessons," Jonathan said, shutting the door of the car. The moment he did so, the car pulled away, and he led Kylie down the street. "We'll need to walk for a bit. It's not a good idea to arrive in a town car where we are going." "Where are we going?" Kylie grumped, feeling somewhat lost. "The Red Arms. Quinn's pub. He's the 𝗀𝗵𝗿𝗀𝗀, blood elder, and he's hosting the arena tonight. Should be pretty interesting." "Care to explain what an arena is?" "Oh, right," Jonathan said, looking abashed. "Think Roman gladiatorial arenas, except with Eternals, caught hunters, and other supernaturals." By this time, the pair had finally arrived at the pub. Unlike what she initially thought, the pub was actually a multi-story establishment that sprawled over the expanse of a block. Dark windows glittered, and a constant flow of people entered and exited the establishment. Jonathan did not approach the main exit, though, instead leading the pair around the building to a smaller, more discreet entrance. There, a hulking man watched and rejected casual passers-by, offering a single nod to the pair as they neared. Inside, the door opened onto a small landing for a set of staircases that led up and down. Jonathan guided Kylie downstairs without a word, the noise of the crowd beneath their feet resounding through the enclosed brick stairwell. Underneath, loud, bass-driven music thrummed, while a heaving press of bodies circled around bars and small tables. Stadium seating circled the inset, an underground, sanded arena where currently a pair of Eternals were fighting with rapiers. The flashing blades licked out, clashing and pulling back in a shower of glinting steel. Sharp blades entered bodies, leaving wounds that dribbled blood, which were ignored by the fighting pair. Outside of a few enthusiasts, the fighting was mostly ignored by the crowd. The attendees of the arena were a different breed than those at the ball. Leather, latex, and rubber seemed to be the most popular clothing choice, though flashes of plate and chainmail could be seen as well. While black continued to dominate the spectrum of color, other more unique and garish purples, pinks, and greens could be seen. It reminded Kylie of a mix between an S&M party and a midnight rave, both events that she had spent much of her youth at. Kylie could not help but find herself smiling slightly, eyes glinting at the heady atmosphere. This was something she could get her teeth into. Jonathan, watching her, shook his head ruefully. Well, it seemed that she would likely be re-rolling her character if she kept at this. "Jonathan!" Even over the throb of music, the roaring voice cut through the din. Kylie turned to see who it was, her eyes widening at the absolute beast of a man that came striding towards them. Topping even Jonathan's 6'3" by a foot, the ebony-skinned, shaven-haired man wore only a simple leather vest. "Quinn?" Jonathan greeted the man, sticking a hand out. It was grasped, and Jonathan was pulled into a back-slapping, single-armed hug by the muscular man. Jonathan was then pushed away from the black man, his body given a quick once-over. "Good. Very good. I was thinking this night was going to be a failure," Quinn said. "Quinn, this is Karen. I'm showing her around," Jonathan said, waving to Kylie. Kylie dropped a quick nod, deciding that a curtsy would be out of place here. "Huh, I heard. She looks to be enjoying herself," Quinn replied and then shook his head. I need you to join the lineup. My headliner and my backup pulled out on me. Bloody cowards. No. Jonathan shook his head, holding a hand up. I'm showing a friend around, not taking part in your games. Excuses. Come on. It's an alpha lichen. You know you want to. Quinn wheedled, gesturing towards the arena. You know none of these wimps are going to take it on. What's an alpha lichen? Kylie asked. Boss of the pack for a group of werewolves. Bigger, stronger, and able to use their middle form. Very tough to beat. Jonathan answered before glaring at Quinn. And, are you insane? There's no way I'm fighting an alpha alone. Jonathan, I don't want to do this, Quinn started. Then don't. I'm calling in my favor. Fuck you, Quinn. I should never have made a deal with you. Jonathan growled and rotated his shoulders. An alpha. This is going to be a real pain, you know. Good man. Let me know if you need anything. Quinn, having won his way, slapped Jonathan on the shoulder and left to inform the announcer of the change of plans. Jonathan? Right. I have to do this. Sorry, Jonathan said, his eyes fixed on the arena floor. His voice had grown more detached, colder as he settled into a fighting mindset. What is going on? I owed him a favor. System registered and everything. If you refuse to fulfill a favor, you receive an Oathbreaker title that anyone can see. It makes it much more difficult for you to complete deals in the future. Only way to get rid of the title is to fulfill the favor. Have the person owed waive the title willingly, or time. A lot of time. Are you going to be able to win? She asked, and Jonathan shrugged in answer. Lips thin, Kylie followed as Jonathan walked to the waiting rooms. She noted that he seemed to know his way around quite well, probably because he had done this before. The announcement of the change was clear and loud, and the music shut off for a few seconds while they answered. The roar of approval was so loud, Kylie blinked and tilted her head to stare at her friend. Exactly who was Jonathan in this world? He mixed with blood elders and knew the politics of the city, but he seemed to be well known among the arena fighters. More and more mysteries to be unraveled. She wanted to ask, but his fixed face as he waited warned her off. Time slipped by as the undercard fought on the small television screen. Kylie watched in fascination, torn between wanting to watch the fights in person and supporting her friend. After a time, Jonathan looked up and said, Go. Needing no further encouragement, Kylie rushed out of the waiting room. It took her only a few minutes to find the exit, but outside, she realized that she had no clue where to go. The crowd around the arena was so packed, so excited, that she had no chance of getting closer. The crowd might have been enthusiastic before, but now they practically bounced in the air. Where to go now? Kylie muttered to herself, deciding finally on making a circuit. Perhaps she could find a seat. 2 full circuits later, Kylie had to admit that even the cheap seats were now filled. Disappointed, she moved to the back, closer to the bar. Unlike the ball, there were no liveried servants offering fresh sustenance. Here, the bars served chilled blood in bottles to the attendees. Karen, isn't it? The loud, gravelly voice behind her made her turn. She found herself smiling at the familiar face in relief. Yes. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were out here. Come, you can join me at my box. Well, it's the least I can do. I did take away your guide, Quinn said, offering his hand. After a brief moment of hesitation, Kylie took it and let herself be led to the box. The box itself was small, though mostly empty. Grateful for the relative peace, Kylie sighed and seated herself. Beneath her, a green-skinned, long-eared, wiry creature fought with an Eternal, using a spear and shield. The Eternal wielded a whip, lashing the monster whenever it offered an opening. How did it get so busy? The chance for a master to finally get his ass kicked? We're turning people away at the door. My betting floor is going nuts, Quinn said as loudly as ever. But why?
He didn't tell you, did he? Let's just say your friend has made more than a few enemies. Of course, none of them have the guts to fight him themselves.
Can he win?
Hard to say. He's a tough son of a bitch,
Quinn said before he shrugged.
But it's an alpha lichen. My main and backup were full parties. He's going to fight it alone. I wouldn't bet on it myself.
Qiyle fell silent, staring out at the arena. The Eternal was pinned to the ground with a spear, his whip just out of his reach. Above him, his opponent was repeatedly slamming the edge of his shield into the Eternal's head until he finally stopped struggling. Letting loose a roar of triumph, the green-skinned monster strode around the arena, daring the handlers to come get him. What happens when you die?
You lose some blood potency and skills, and you are locked out until you resurrect eventually at your base, or a secondary base if your first is compromised. Most lockouts are a week long, but the older and more powerful your character is, the longer the lockout.
Qiyle nodded again as the green-skinned monster was netted and dragged out for the next undercard. Lips pursed, she turned to Quinn. I want to join the fight.
With Jonathan?
Yes.
You don't stand a chance.
That's fine. I'm here to learn about the game, after all. Dying is part of the game.
You know what? It's fine. You should get to the waiting room then.
Qiyle nodded quickly, standing up and then pausing. Seeing her confusion, Quinn called an attendant over to guide her to the waiting rooms, while he went to announce the change. Inside the waiting room, she found a sight that made her smile. Seated, cross-legged, was the large bruiser, meditating. Her entrance, though, alerted him immediately, and when he opened his eyes, Qiyle found herself shivering, as the lizard hindbrain remembered what it is to be prey.
Qiyle.
As quickly as it was there, the feeling faded as the intensity in his gaze subsided.
This is not a good time.
That's not a nice thing to say to your partner, Qiyle said as she strode into the room, plopping down next to him.
What are you talking about?
I asked to join your fight. Jonathan frowned.
You've seen the arena?
Yes.
Good. There's not going to be a lot of space. When we enter, we should split up. I'll draw its attention immediately with my guns. Hopefully I can slow it down. When you find an opening, hit it. Attacks from the back and side work best. In its mid-form, you'll find the lichen has roughly the same body structure, though its ribs will be higher than you'd expect. So, wherever you'd hit a man, you'd hit a lichen. In wolf form, Jonathan paused and shook his head. Actually, don't worry about targeting when it's in wolf form. Just stab it. You're not going to stop me? Nope.
Silence filled the waiting room, punctuated only by the occasional roar of approval or disapproval from the crowd outside. In the end, Qiyle gave in and asked, Why?
It's a game. It's not my place to tell you how you'll have the most fun,
Jonathan answered, and Qiyle blinked, slowly nodding. Right. It was just a game. So why was she growing nervous? Qiyle wiped her palms against her pants, marveling again at the realism of the game. After a time, with Jonathan back meditating, Qiyle took her knives out from their sheath to play with them nervously. It was fascinating how the knife itself was discolored, silver and gray streaks interlacing the blade in a waterfall pattern. A few years ago, she had taken a self-defense course for an article she had to write for the school paper. They had briefly talked about and played with knives, and she cudgeled her brain for the half-remembered information. You held the blade like this, right? A knock on the door broke Qiyle out of contemplation of her blades. Sliding them back into the sheaths after repositioning them to the sides, she looked over to Jonathan, who had stood smoothly from the floor. He offered her a single encouraging nod before walking to the door. Led by an attendant, the walk to the arena seemed to take forever. Qiyle could hear the thud of her pulse in her ears, the smell of sweat, blood, and alcohol filling her lungs. Each step seemed to resound on the concrete floors, taking her closer to the fight. Once again, she reminded herself that this was just a game. Just a game. The roars when they entered the arena made her draw a startled breath.
The lights were so bright here. Looking around, she found her vision narrowing as she began to breathe faster. A hand caught hers, and she gasped, tugging on it as she scrambled for her knife in its sheath, only to realize that it was just Jonathan. "Easy there. Just focus on breathing," Jonathan said, his head bent low to whisper into her ear, "In, out, again." 𝗁𝗘 found herself following his instructions unconsciously, his hand squeezing the rhythm for her. As she calmed down, she found her vision opening up again, and she looked up, seeing the crowd again. Again, her breath caught before Jonathan tugged on her arm to bring her attention back to him. "Focus. Don't look up. Just down here. That's all there is. Got it?" 𝗁𝗘 nodded dumbly, and Jonathan flashed her a smile before he released her hand. "Draw your knives. It's about to begin." Grasping the knives, she fumbled them out and stared as Jonathan prowled to the other side. She marveled at how relaxed he seemed, as if none of this affected him. At the jerk of his head, she looked back to the other entrance, whose portcullis had begun to slowly rise. When it was a few feet off the ground, a four-legged monster of a wolf surged forward, jerked short by the chain held to its neck. Standing nearly 4 feet tall at its shoulders, the black and gray wolf snarled as it sought their lives. At a shouted command from above, the chain around the lichen's neck fell away. Beside her, Jonathan fired his guns, the staccato explosions assaulting her ears. Wounds blossomed across the lichen's body as the rounds impacted, throwing up bursts of blood that did little to stop the barreling monster. It charged straight for Jonathan, drawn to the older Eternal by his fire. The sudden eruption of violence held 𝗁𝗘 enthralled, the acrid smell of cordite filling her nostrils. As the lichen jumped towards Jonathan, her friend jumped and spun, lashing out a kick that caught the creature in midair, sending it spinning to the ground. The wolf crashed to the arena floor, unable to keep its footing before it began to shudder. Landing smoothly, Jonathan kept firing, pouring round after round into the monster. None of it seemed to affect the creature at all. Bullets began to pop out of its body as the body elongated and increased in bulk even further. A frustrated snarl filled the air as Jonathan dropped a gun and began reloading the other. As swiftly as he moved, the monster's transformation was quicker, and by the time he was ready to fire again, the creature was on its feet again, standing arms akimbo and roaring. Hoots and jeers filled the stadium even as Jonathan opened fire again, targeting the creature's face. The fight picked up pace even further as Jonathan glowed with an ethereal light and sped up to match the monster. What had been a blur before for 𝗁𝗘 became a series of snapshots, her own role forgotten. The pair began to run and dodge around the arena, Jonathan constantly firing and reloading his gun, while the larger monster charged the Eternal again and again. Each time, the man would escape from being cornered by the narrowest of margins, sidestepping, rolling, jumping, and even once sliding beneath the monster. Each attempt was not without cost, as the blood that began to dot the arena indicated. Twice they ran past 𝗁𝗘, and on the second occurrence, a glancing blow by the monster sent her spinning into the arena wall. The blow ripped open her chest, cutting through armor, clothing, and flesh with ease, leaving her writhing in pain. When 𝗁𝗘 finally pulled herself straight, she found that Jonathan had finally run out of luck. A mistimed dodge had the monster pinning Jonathan to the wall, its second hand desperately caught in descent. Straining with both hands against the monster, the two were locked in stasis. Blood soaked both combatants, open wounds dripping red ambrosia to the ground. From her vantage point, 𝗁𝗘 could see the straining back muscles and the ragged breathing of the lichen. "Get up and help him, you stupid bent." The harsh words startled 𝗁𝗘, the command forcing her to stand. As she realized that she was not a watcher, but a participant, she found herself running forward. What was it that Jonathan said? Hit it where it hurt? Ducking low, she swung underhanded, bringing the knife up between the monster's legs. She missed her initial target, having swung just a little early, and instead of castrating the monster, she managed to bury her knife between its buttocks. The monster screamed, surprised and shocked, as it was violated by the weapon. Released, Jonathan sprung back to his feet, and gripping the monster by its shoulders and body,
He ripped into its furry throat with his fangs. The monster struggled, lashing out with its hand and raking the man's body, while behind him, Qialy took the opportunity to repeatedly plunge the knife into its back. For a few moments more, the monster struggled. Before it collapsed to the ground, Jonathan clamped around its neck. Even as she watched, the wounds on Jonathan's back slowly closed, the ethereal glow slowly fading away. She blinked as Jonathan pushed away after a time, his mouth covered in blood, to gesture her forwards. "What? No," she said. "Drink. It's yours too," Jonathan urged her. Standing only a few feet away from the creature, she found the intoxicating scent of the blood overpowering. It smelled of steak and champagne and roses, of the best chocolate mousses and cookie dough. Qialy whimpered and found herself on her hands and knees, holding the monster's ruined head in her hands. Her resistance crumbled under the assault of her senses, and she buried her mouth in the fur and flesh, whimpering with pleasure as all those tastes and more rushed into her. She whimpered, her body growing wet as the waves of warm pleasure rushed down her throat. Unbeknownst to her, her own flesh began to glow as the potent blood knitted her body together. Finally satiated, Qialy looked up to see Jonathan smiling at her. She smiled back, blood dripping down her lips as her eyes glowed. She grinned, standing up and kissing him full on the lips, hungry for more as she molded her body to his. Her shirt torn, she pressed bare flesh against his and whispered, "Room, now." Jonathan grinned and quickly led her to the same entrance they had entered a short few minutes ago. Qialy found herself flushing further as the catcalls and roars of approval reached her ears, the crowd obviously understanding what was about to happen. In truth, it took all her willpower not to tear Jonathan's clothes off right there and then and mount him. Inside the room, she grabbed the larger man and threw him against the bench, straddling him as she ripped the tattered remains of her vest and top off. Jonathan's hands reached up, cupping her breast as they spilled free, before he ran his thumbs across her hard nipples. The movement sent an electric jolt down Qialy's spine, making her arch her spine. She panted out loud as he then lowered his mouth over her nipple, the warm, wet sensation of his tongue sliding along her skin, making her grind on top of him. Too turned on for slow play, Qialy pushed his head away from her body as she fumbled at his trousers, pulling them down to reveal Jonathan's long, hard prick. Absently, she noted that he was uncircumcised before she plunged her head downwards. His heady, sweaty musk filled her nose and mixed with the ever-present smell of blood, making her even wetter as she began to bob on his cock. She tasted him on her tongue as she used her lips to push back his hood, before sliding her tongue against the sensitive head. Sucking on the cock, Qialy thought to try something new. How long could she keep this pressure up? After all, an eternal required significantly less oxygen than a human. Smirking to herself, she kept the pressure on, looking up to meet Jonathan's eyes. He was watching her, mouth open slightly, eyes slightly unfocused as she continued to bob. As she brought his head to her lips again and swirled her tongue around it, a stifled moan escaped his lips. As if the noise was her starting gun, Qialy let the cock go and quickly stripped her pants down, hooking her fingers around the thong to slide them down at the same time as her pants. A part of her noted that the thong was so much more comfortable to wear in-game than in real life, before she dismissed the thought and straddled his powerful legs. Expertly guiding him into her, she whimpered slightly as the head pushed apart her lips and slipped inside. Jonathan arched his back, desperate to push deeper, but Qialy rose with him, silky skin on his shirt. He grunted as she pushed him down again and ripped his shirt off completely, running a nail sharply down his chest. Muscles glistened as she left a red line along his skin before she finally let herself down fully, sliding all the way in. Relaxing into the feeling of being filled completely, Qialy rocked her hips back and forth on his as her fangs extended, plunging into his neck. The taste of his blood made her pussy clench, her arms locked around his. She groaned around the bite, his blood tasting even better than the lichens. Waves of pleasure rocked up from her pussy to her head and then down again, each wave building on the other, in an explosion that had her body clenching tight. For what seemed to be minutes, she swam in the pleasure before she found herself conscious of her own body again. Wow. Yeah, Jonathan grinned and kissed her before he murmured, and we're only just getting started. Hours later, Kylie finally pulled the VR helmet off her head. She breathed in and then exhaled raggedly, realizing that not everything stayed in the game. Between eternal stamina, adjusted physics, and an abandonment that came with knowing that it was all virtual, the last few hours had been wild. Lazily running a finger down her body, she smiled at the memories. Well, perhaps the virtual world had its own charms. This has been First Steps into the Night, written by 𝗃𝗺𝗃𝗀, narrated by Stephanie Németh-Parker. Copyright 2021 by 𝗃𝗺𝗃𝗀. Production copyright 2021 by 𝗃𝗺𝗃𝗀.
Another Day, Another Plot. A Vampire LitRPG Story by 𝗃𝗺𝗃𝗀. Narrated by Derek Scholes. The eastern wind blows in from the bay, bringing with it the chill of the Atlantic Ocean. A couple of human goons standing around their charges pull their heavy long coats closer, head hunching down a bit. They're all the same type. Big burly men who could have been taken off the defense of any football field. Mook version 4.0, the most common goon choice. Even hunched over, they kept their hands hovering near the opening of their jackets and their eyes on their opponents. In between the guards, standing before one another, were a pair of talking men, their charges and targets, depending on who you asked. One was dressed in an expensive charcoal gray suit and wing-tipped shoes with a hawkish nose and haughty expression. The other, a scruffy bearded man in biker leathers. Watching them, I can't help but note the differences in their body languages, the way they moved, talked. The man in biker leathers exudes confidence, his body language open, the weight of his feet spread evenly and centering him. He leans forward a little, just a bit, to convey his aggressive posture, one hand gesturing wide. On the other hand, the suit's body language is a little more withdrawn, mixed between the player's natural inclinations and the software attempting to compensate. I know, if he allows it, the software will shift his body posture to match his opponent, letting it grow more aggressive, more confident. High social stats always help with that, but the player is new, unable to trust the software. At least, not yet. I let my gaze shift from the pair, leaving them to their clandestine negotiations, already knowing the result. I've seen dozens of these in my time, played go-between for newbies and old hands. The most dangerous moments occur at the start of a meet, where the potential for violence escalates, where a human needs to conduct the monkey dance and the software's alpha-beta challenge protocols mix, escalating tensions between competing player vampires. Once that was over, though, and the threat of betrayal was over, the major concerns in such a meet dropped off significantly. A breakdown in negotiations were possible, of course, but it often did not lead to violence. Betrayal or a third-party attack was a concern at the end of the negotiation, but that was why I had picked this spot. There were only a few ways to get to the dock, and both land-bound methods were under watch by my men. Not that I trusted the software to do everything, which was why I was here. Soon enough, the pair broke off with one final handshake. There is a slight ripple in the air around them as the sound words they directed around their bodies go down, allowing me to hear their conversation in full. Not that there is much left to hear, beyond traditional well wishes and goodbyes. After that, there's a little more posturing, a little more careful negotiation as they leave by their respective modes of transportation, armored limousine and fat bikes respectively. Once they part ways and are on the ground, automated driving software taking over, my job is done. A series of beeps and notifications appear on the minimalistic interface I run, informing me that the user-generated quest is complete, along with a deposit into my account. I then detach myself from the wall that I positioned myself on, ankle-length black leather trench coat flowing around my feet, crisscross tactical gun holsters pulling tight against my avatar's broad chest. In one of the mirrors I carefully positioned around the meat, I catch a glimpse of my avatar's face. Brown hair, coal-black eyes, and an angular nose, and I chuckled darkly. As per government regulations, avatars can only be altered by up to 20% in full immersion dives. More than that, and issues with body dysphoria, body dysmorphia, depersonalization, derealization, and other psychological issues start cropping up at significant levels. Once I've swept the area once again, checking for bugs and any additional complications, I stroll up the road, heading for a small clearing just off the main drag where my guards, Mook version 11, 14, and 18, stand guard over the pair of party crashers I'd found waiting for us beforehand. They're trussed up tight, heavy steel chains wrapped around their bodies, all attached to heavy weights to keep them held down. Blindfolds cover their eyes, sound-dampening headphones over their ears with old-school polka playing non-stop. Torture, but in a nice way. I grin, crouching down before the pair and yank off their blindfolds, long, sharp canine teeth dropping low. Intimidation factor cranked up to 10. I drop my voice lower. Most gamers are into the active skills that Eternal Night offers. Celeritas for speed, Viris for might, Salubr for health and healing. But personally, I prefer the passives. 𝗪𝗏𝗄 works on a passive level, giving NPCs and even player-controlled avatars a debuff against keeping information from. I stare deep into their eyes and drop my voice low, my avatar's deep South Devonshire British accent harsher than ever. Let's have a chat now, shall we, gents? One of the things about running a covert and semi-legal operation is the fact that everyone feels they can horn in on your business. And the fact that the Blood Guard, NPC-driven vampire cops, also have player-controlled members, many of whom are just as corrupt as you can imagine, and security for the meets and deals I put together is always a concern. Unfortunately for me, and the mooks, their employer was smart enough to use a cutout. It's a mortal cutout, too, that met them in the middle of the day, and which will be waiting for the phone call of their successful action. All that means is that I can't take action directly, but that's not the end of the world. I set my own people on it, and then plug in the offline goals for my avatar. I do that while we drive back to my residence, preferring to keep in control till I'm secure. You never know when you might get hit, and I'm feeling a little paranoid. I've learned my lesson about letting the AI run my character in ambushes. To keep things fair, and to reduce complaints about AI killing, all AI-run active avatars are set to escape rather than do combat and kill. In the early months, that hadn't been the preset, and the storm of complaints and cheating that resulted from that had gotten quite out of hand. Eventually, Eternal Night updated the AI code, and now, even if you outrank and outblood your attackers, as long as there's a single player-driven avatar in play, the avatars just try to run rather than fight it out. It's not better, but more understandable. It does mean that more than one avatar has had their players wake up, tied up, awaiting advanced interrogation, which has led to some fascinating roleplay scenarios, even if it is highly controversial. Torture of players is always going to be an issue. In such scenarios, the AI takes over most of the running, with players receiving no actual pain from such settings. In fact, you could even log out and die on purpose, although there's a time requirement for all that, unless you preset it in your basic system settings. It gets all kinds of complicated, but players have learned to adapt. Mostly these days, avatars get captured and interrogated, since it's more fun for everyone and lets you roleplay rather than having your target just log off and respawn somewhere else. But I've got no time to play that game, so the moment Jonathan's back in his lair, a very nice condo complex, I make my way up to the penthouse condominium. Turn the lights on, go through the process of changing, turning on the security system, both technical and magical, and then I pull the curtains closed. Once I'm secure, I slip into the extra-large closet, trigger the hidden door, and descend via the concealed shaft to the level beneath the underground parking lot, a level that doesn't exist on any platform. And my real home. Only then do I log out, leaving the AI to take care of the last bits of rest and the other orders when Jonathan has rested enough. In the meantime, I've got things to do in the real world. I yank 𝗃𝗵𝗁𝗀𝗀𝗃 virtual reality helmet off my head, rotating my neck and shoulders a little as I sit up. One day, I will buy one of those sleeping pods with their full-body sensor suite and virtual reality gel that's all the rage. But the cost of one of those things puts it out of reach for anyone but the ultra-rich. For now, I'll settle for a hot shower after each dive. Peeling myself out of the full-body sensor mesh, I drop it and the gloves aside and walk towards the bathroom. As I do, I catch sight of myself in the mirror and twitch a little at the sudden vertigo. While it kept most of my features, as suggested by the company, there's still some differences. Spending most of every night being another person, someone with longer hair, who is more rugged and muscular, can throw you off, especially when reality is just a little disappointing. Rather than walk onward, I stop in front of the mirror and study myself. Coal black eyes look back at me, much the same as my avatar. Hair not neatly combed into a short ponytail, but just a messy, sweat-matted length since it had been 4 months since I'd cut my hair. Skin actually darker and less scarred than my avatar's. Muscles, well, no need to discuss that. I prod at the pudge around my stomach, seeing a small layer appearing on my meat form. I probably should consider eating a little healthier. Instant noodles, junk food, and whatever meat on a bun or meat on a stick that's running on sale are not the most sustainable food sources. And it's not as if I'm getting any younger. A few more minutes of inspecting myself, getting used to who I am in this world, the real world, I have to remind myself. And then it's shower time. Washing the stink off the night helps, though I don't get to enjoy the hot water for very long before it cuts off. Letting out a manly yelp, I verified that I should still have time on my hot water ration before I jump out. Other than the emergency batteries that I use to keep my VR gear charged and my connection stable, everything else is off. Probably the solar panels are going out again. Grumbling to myself, I get dressed and head out the door, snagging a toasted frozen waffle on the way out. 4 floors of stairs later, I poke my head out of the roof and catch sight of the early morning Vancouver skyline. It's beautiful, especially since the majority of the pollution has disappeared ever since we shifted over to electric vehicles for the most part. Of course, downtown Vancouver's a little quiet, the rich and the employed having chosen to live in the North Shore. The Lionsgate Bridge is one of the few bridges still caught out in traffic jams, since so few of the rich choose to share their journey into their offices. Idiotic and wasteful, but they've got the funds for it. Unlike the rest of us, living off the too little basic universal income which goes less and less far each year. One day, one of the politicians will actually follow through on their promises and link it to inflation. Till then, we make do. I draw a deep breath, enjoying the sparkling waves of the Pacific Ocean on my left and the smell of salt on the air. Then I keep turning, spotting the office towers, half of them empty or converted into residences ever since remote work had become the thing, and see the solar panels covering the rest of the roof. Beneath the panels is warm earth and greenery, all to provide a little insulation and even more variety to our food. Though the argument between the gardeners and the rest of the condo board about use of space is enough to drive one mad. It doesn't take me long to spot Andre, the old electrician bent over the connection between the panels with his toolbox set up beside him. Treading my way to him, carefully, I spot the power boxes pulled apart, peering at the insides with wires everywhere. Down again? I say. Yeah, entire routing assembly is down, Andre says, brushing his hands off. Trying to work around, but... Didn't you do that a week ago? 5 days. I sigh. Ever since we started selling off our electricity to the States, energy prices have shot through the roof. To help offset that, we started using the solar generators to power the building during the day. In theory, we get enough power to run the building, charge the solar batteries for emergencies, and even sell some energy back to the grid. In so doing, we lower the overall bill. Some months in summer we even get a credit, which helps all of us. And considering at least half of the residents in the complex are fully retired, every single dollar counts. How much to change it out? I ask. Depends, but figure between 4 to 6, Andre says. I sigh and nod. Right. Write it down, will you? I gotta head down to the yard anyway. Maybe I can find something. You don't have to. I know, I shrug. I don't, but unlike most of those here, I do have a job. of sorts, which means I get to earn more and, spend it. And losing an entire bank of solar panels would cost us that much in a few months in lost revenue. If we waited for the co-op board to approve the maintenance cost, we'd be waiting at least a month, if not longer. We get away with a ton of things that most other boards wouldn't because we're a full cooperative, but it also means a lot more bureaucracy. Anyway, I'll probably get paid back. Eventually. Well, if you're headed to the yard, I laugh and hold my hand out. In short order, I'm down the street with a long shopping list of things we need from the yard. On the way, I make a mental note to look into food, too. Now, I just have to hope I've got enough 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃 dollars. The only reason I was willing and able to help out as much as I did was because the yard was one of 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃's affiliate companies. By the time I get back hauling the junk I'd found from the yard, having had to fight off a half-dozen other customers in between for my finds, the sun was headed to the horizon and my stomach was growling. I make it to Andre's room with a backpack, drop the entire thing off, and grab the takeout sushi before departing without a word. Got to get to work, and the entire side quest off in the yard had taken more time than I cared for. The good news was that I'd managed to find a couple versions of the panel for Andre. The bad news, both of them were rather broken, so I wasn't sure how useful either was. Then again, Andre was pretty damn good at making do, so hopefully all the stuff I got for him worked. As for myself, I had an in-game threat to deal with. Getting dressed and ready is routine by now. I was one of the pioneers in the game, jumping on it well before the tech and software was all the way ready. Hell, I'd run around on the live beta test, filing enough bug reports that they'd brought me in as one of the player NPCs. One of Eternal Knight's smartest moves was to create player NPCs, semi-paid and employed individuals who helped create plot lines and smooth out interacts for new players in-game. Setting up and sorting the meeting last night was just one of the many things that I did, all in-game and role-played. There were quite a few of us player NPCs. Unlike the fully paid employees of 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, we only got paid based on the number of player plot lines and interactions we helped create. On the other hand, it also meant we were paid directly by players too, whether in-game or in real life. That second option was only available to us legally, and a lot of our transactions were closely monitored, since there was concern of pay-to-win dynamics coming in. All of which is a long way to say, when I log in and view the AI-generated memories of what my avatar had been doing, I was doing so with a careful eye towards how it would disrupt my earnings, and just as importantly, how I could use it to create a new storyline. Because you never know. One of my best paydays was setting up an interlineage fight between 4 groups that got both the Bloods and Fangers involved, all because some idiot new Blood thought he could hone in on my territory. Unfortunately, the memory and information the AI provides me is less than useful. I get a name, but it's not one that I know. My guards also note that they had to rough up the cutout quite badly, leaving him injured and in the hospital. Which means, if the player, and it is certainly a player, that got involved is paying attention or logging in, they'll know I'm chasing them down. Once I get dressed and out of my bunker, the next step is easy enough to work out. While I might be connected, I'm not connected. Not like some others. And if there's a person who might know of a new Blood in play, it's Charlotte Renard. Of course, visiting her means I have to dress up, which is why I make sure to slide on a nice suit beforehand and to pack my other set of clothing into a bag. Because, if I know anything about life in Eternal Night, is that having an extra pair of clothes is never a waste. Not when blood is in the air. Jonathan Masters. She says my name like a purr. Charlotte Renard, gorgeous as always, blonde with curves in all the right places, and with a grace that I know to be natural. Though, I've noticed how much more comfortable she has grown in the years we've known one another with a sex kitten act. Almost as though the system takes cues from us, makes it better, and then we learn from it. And, considering she's a 𝗃𝗶𝗃𝗃, the sex kitten and socialite act is perfect. Heck, she has attributes all devoted to it. Charlotte. I take the offered hand and bow over it, making sure not to kiss. My gaze sweeps over the ball, taking in the court dances going on down below. An affectation among certain members of the Blood who feel it plays more into their made-up histories, and the grouped vampires chatting away and plotting while sipping at glasses of blood. A half-dozen plots will be resolved by the end of the night. A dozen more will begin, and countless others will be advanced. Half the game, if not more, for the Bloods happens on nights like this. But, eyeing the numbers below, I can't help but wince internally. Numbers are down. Again.
A pleasure to see you, old friend. I'm so glad to see you. There are a few newcomers that I'd love to introduce you to.
Charlotte trails off, a smile on her lips as she flicks a glance down into the group below. I follow her gaze, picking out the players, though not entirely sure of which one. I don't put it past her to try to trick me with her gaze either. And me, you. I pause, almost tempted. More contacts are good, and Charlotte is almost always good at weeding out the casuals. Not that we mind them, but they just aren't good long-term investments. But I'm actually here on business. I was hoping you could help me with it.
Oh.
And there's a flash of disappointment, one that I'm sure is genuine. We're seeing a little bit of a lull now, with the latest expansion release not having the desired effect of drawing in new players. The entire game is still going well, but without new players, any MMO dies. Like myself, Charlotte's a player NPC, so we've both tied our income to the game.
Well, if you promise to return.
Maybe not tonight, but tomorrow, or the day after for sure. And you can pass them my direct contact if they miss me tomorrow, I say. It's not something I normally do, have my number passed around. But I'm in a hurry, and like her, I'm worried about the state of the game. Making it fun for the newbies is important.
Done. Now, what do you need?
Charlotte asks, sliding herself up to me and placing a hand on my arm. I glance down at it briefly, but don't make any move to take it away. It's nice, and a little warm. 𝗶𝗵𝗄𝗃 trick and skill, allowing them to have mortal warmth. Makes it easier for hunting, unlike the room temperature warmth of my own body. Also makes it harder for hunters to find. Which might be even more important if the rumor of the next expansion edition holds any water. Or blood, if you will. Amos how? Know anything? I query.
Amos.
Charlotte taps her lips, considering, then shakes her head.
No.
Damn. I was sure he'd be a blood.
Do you want me to
keep an ear out? I nod. If you will. I guess I need to make another stop. Charlotte makes a face and I chuckle, bowing to her. She snorts once and waves me off, and I make my way out, well before the other players notice me or slow me down. As much as I'd like to talk and make some connections, figuring out who it was that was trying to disrupt my meet is more important. If nothing else, I might be able to resell the information. Rather than go directly to the Red Arms, I check the chat feature first and realize that Quinn isn't on. That's a little strange, all things considered. He's another player NPC, and on nearly as often as I or Charlotte. We don't earn anything if we aren't working, and he makes a good chunk of his cash running the arena. Then again, it's not his turn tonight, but still. I shake my head and leave him a message before moving on. I'll owe him for the answer, one way or the other, but in the meantime, I need to figure out what's next. There are a few other options, but eventually, I fall back on Dram. Making my way over to Dram is a little harder than normal. He's a 𝗪𝗏𝗏. Yes, just like the old movie. Lore has it that they are Eastern European vampires, coming from a different lineage and thus the different features. Players for 𝗪𝗏𝗏 are all a little strange, since you have to pass some quite extensive psychological tests to play them. They're a premium race, though, with a requisite upgrade and monthly payments. It means most of the 𝗪𝗏𝗏 players are rich kids with nothing better to do. Dram probably is too, though he never lords it over us. In fact, he's a pure role player. Funnily enough, he role-plays a vampiric hacker who spends his entire time in his quarters staring at a dozen monitors. I don't get it, but if there's information to be had, he often has it. Between his AI-assisted hacking, his contacts, and the other 𝗪𝗏𝗏 feeding him their information, he's also one of the major powers in the city. The car pulls up in front of his mansion in short order, and we do the whole security personnel rigmarole. I pay attention as we roll in, counting the total number of guards and their positions, as well as the types. 7 different mooks and 3 ex-military mooks. They have a different set of avatars, is my count before I get ushered in by his butler. A blood doll, one played by a real player. This time around, there's no one behind the wheel, so I ignore him beyond the basic pleasantries required. I do wonder about Dram's background and his blood doll's relationship. How boring was it to run a character whose whole job was play butler? Then again, who am I to say? Hannah, my own blood doll, is more than happy with the little jobs I give her. Though she hasn't logged in for a few weeks. Audit season was always tough on her. Pushing thoughts of her aside, I walk into Dram's operations center. It's the kind of operations center you see more in movies for hackers than in real life, with multiple monitors and racks of CPUs, all with glowing and blinking lights. I sometimes wonder if it's a Dram choice or a game-driven one. Certainly, as he tosses one of his bags of junk food down and watches it disappear, the lack of grunge is purely game-driven. Dram? Jonathan Masters, you're looking for Amos Howe, yes? Dram says, spinning his chair around. Leather and posh, with a high back for his head and all. Of course, the big ears and pale skin, along with long fingers that make up his lineage's characteristics, are there to be seen. But it's paired with a Pokemon vest and yoga pants, which kind of throws off the whole vibe. I'd ask how you know, but I don't think you'd tell me. Oh, that's easy enough. It was me who sold them the information of your meat, Dram says blithely. I twitch but make no threatening moves. There's a reason Dram isn't my first choice to meet. Anything he knows is up for sale, including this conversation. I do wonder how he knew about the meat and debate if I need to up my own security. Then again, he could as easily have hacked into my guards' phones and have the AI call it good. That is one of the more complicated issues of using NPCs in an open world like this, where everything is open to interpretation and manipulation. Great. And now you're selling him out, I say, lips peeled a little. You know how it goes, Dram said unashamedly. Fine. What do you want? Now Dram hesitates. I get the feeling it's more for dramatic effect than actual hesitation, especially because he goes as far as to tap those thin, gray lips of his with one long taloned finger. A favor? No, I shake my head. No way am I owing him a favor. I'm not sure how much I need from the Jonathan Masters. He opens his hands. I have all that I need, you see. Well, if that was the case, we wouldn't be talking. A favor? No, I repeat just as firmly and quickly. Choose again. Then I think we're done. Dram spins his chair around and I shrug, turning around and walking to the door. I make it all the way out the door and almost to the entrance, the silent butler trailing me when the speakers in the house bark out. Come back, Jonathan. You made your point. I don't bother hiding my smile when I wander back in, going so far as to lean against the door with my arms crossed. You're a hard negotiator. Doesn't help that you're not the only information broker around. Dram grunts, crossing his arm. I stay silent too till he finally speaks. There's a shipment coming in on the I-142 tomorrow. I need it to not arrive. I nod. I also don't want any ties leading back to me. I can keep my mouth shut. I ponder for a second, running through what I need to know. Details of the transport and security. And who is it for? I can't say. Local or national? It's a regional power trying to make some waves. Nothing that will harm your local contacts, Dram says. The rest of the information I'll send along, but it's nothing you can't handle. I catch the way he says it. Probably going to annoy some of my regional contacts, if they learn it's me. So I'll have to play it careful. Even if they do, everyone gets business is business. Fine. Deal. Dram spins around and taps a few things on his keyboard. A second later, my phone chimes. I pull it out to see an email from the man, and I can't help but shake my head a little. I could think of other ways this information could be handed to me, but whatever. Thankfully, I do have an encrypted phone and email server. When I look up, I note he hasn't bothered spinning around. I stand there for a few seconds more before I realize he's dismissed me. Rolling my eyes, I walk out, already pulling the information up. Sadly, it takes my phone a while to decrypt the information, which is the game's way of setting up more obstacles in a thieving situation. Whatever. I'll read in the car, then find out who the hell Amos Howe finally is. Fuck me sideways and put a cherry on top. I glare at the phone and the information that I've received, reading over the text once more. I seriously consider asking the driver to turn around so I can go back and kick Dram up and down his mansion before cooler heads prevail. Firstly, and rather dangerously, Amos isn't a new blood. He's just new to the city. He's an immigrant, a blood from another city trying to make a name for himself here. Which is all well and good, except the way he's chosen to make a name is by taking my business out and setting himself up as a go-between. Of course, first steps seem to be focused on killing my reputation. If he's an old blood rather than someone new, I'm going to have to change how I deal with him. Older players have more resources, are a lot less likely to be intimidated by me appearing in their bedrooms and then cutting their head off. Oh, they'd be pissed, but they'd be used to it, and just wait for the logout timing to disappear while playing on their alt accounts. And once they were back, things would really heat up. Newbies, well, you could often just skip the cutting the head off part and use both a carrot and stick approach. I'm going to have to consider how to deal with Amos, since killing his avatar is never a permanent solution. Still, Amos's status is not Dram's fault, and not something I'd be upset with him about. What has me angry is the fact that he's got me intercepting a delivery, one that, if I'm reading it right, is paid for by a rival of Amos's. In a roundabout way, it seems I'm going to be helping the damn vampire who is after me. The only good news is that the actual delivery is relatively simple, lacking both extensive security measures and any sensible secrecy precautions. I literally have a dossier on the drivers and the security personnel involved. Now, the only question is what to do. Planning for the heist the next day, along with a visit to Charlotte's gathering, takes up most of the rest of the night. This time around, I spend my time hobnobbing and making contact with a bunch of newbies, including a few that are quite eager to get stuck into things. One of them even makes me think he's more suited for Quinn's crowd than Charlotte's, and I make arrangements to let Quinn know, whenever the damn man makes it back in. Once all that is settled, I actually log out early and get some real rest. While running Eternal Night allows one to sort of rest, it's not the same as real sleep, and it will catch up with you eventually. It's why I have a semi-nocturnal schedule. If I didn't have so many daytime commitments, I probably would go entirely nocturnal like so many of my compatriots. Cleaning up when I wake up is fast, especially since the solar panels aren't fixed yet. Breakfast, on the other hand, is not so easy. When I poke around my empty larder, realizing that the last frozen waffle I ate last night was everything that I had. I grab the cold ginger from last night's sushi and chew on that as I wash the takeout box I'd brought with me and tried it out before dumping it in my backpack. After checking that I've got my reusable bags for shopping, I step out and head to the roof. "Any luck?" I call out to Andre, who looks up from the panels he's got splayed out before him. He's busy taking them apart along with a few other pieces of junk, swapping out parts and soldering in others. Or, at least that's what I figure he's doing. I've only got a passing understanding of what he's up to, mostly from helping the handyman out when I've got nothing better to do. "Always with the Novacore parts," Andre spits to the side. I can only shrug before he continues. "Better if you get others. Theirs are still built to break down, no matter what they tell the government." I grunt in acknowledgement. I have a feeling Andre has a more optimistic view about the kind of parts the rest of the major cores put out, but I don't tell him that. While I wouldn't necessarily call Novacore a megacorp, it's pretty damn close. Ditto the majority of other big companies and their affiliate reward companies. "Whatever, I fix. Maybe less than another 6 months, Andre says. He snorts a little, clearing his throat, and I frown a little worriedly. "You okay?" "Allergies." I stare at Andre, and he waves a screwdriver at me. "He's fine. Checkup was only a month ago, and they found nothing." "Good." I relax a little. 2 years ago, he'd gotten nose cancer, and the first signs of it had been a nose that hadn't cleared for over a month. If Mrs. Traynor in 402 hadn't badgered him into seeing a doctor, he probably wouldn't have made it. "I'm headed to the store. Need anything?" Andre shakes his head and shoos me off, leaving me to pick up whatever meat there might be. Hopefully something organic and not vat-grown, but I'd take vat-grown if they didn't have stock. Better vat-grown meat than the weird vegetarian meat that is vat-grown, but isn't actually meat, but is meant to taste like it. It boggles my mind that there are people still eating that stuff, when vat-grown meat is no different really than what they eat, just with different starting products. But what do I know? I play a vampire in a game and mime drinking blood all night long. By the time I get home, there's a message for me. I get the house electronics to play it for me over the speakers while I put away my finds, including a haunch of real chuck beef that I'd picked up from a roadside farmer selling out of the trunk of his car. It still cost me nearly, in real dollars too, as much as the rest of my groceries, but there's still something about real meat that the VAT stuff is missing. Thoughts about meat and dinner get derailed as I listen to the message, and I can't help but groan a little. Hey man, yeah, I'm out. Not pulled the plug yet officially, but I got an alpha invite to that new VR MMO, Invincible, run by Suncor. It's rad, man. Medieval with magic, blah, blah, blah. But they're projecting over 7 million accounts opening on launch. They've got a whole system set up for play-to-earn stuff, sort of modeled on Eternal Night in the Legionnaire system, you know? But the way things are going, you know how it is. If you want in, I can probably swing an invite for you too. I blink as the message ends, my hand still holding the cabbage and the refrigerator door still open. I shake my head after a moment and finish putting away the food, reeling from the message. The voice was Quinn. He's an old-timer like me, one of the mainstays. And he's leaving. Sure, the game isn't growing. In fact, the numbers are down a little, but we still got quite a healthy number. And we had that recent article. Okay, that was like 3 months ago, and it was a local paper, but still. Fine, we're just not the hot thing anymore, but we're still chugging along. Earnings have dipped a little, but nothing major. Maybe the last release wasn't perfect, but whatever is. There's no reason to leave Eternal Night, not after we put in so many hours, built everything. And then again, rebuilding your character, starting from scratch, there's something to be said about that. Depending on how they set up the servers, it might even be possible to end up having a somewhat regular schedule, playing only from the afternoons to late night, instead of evenings to early mornings like we do right now. And any medieval world with magic is always hot, if they launch right. And if you get in fast and get lucky, there's a ton you can earn, especially if you figure out a few exploits early on. I'm sure Quinn would let me join their guild, or perhaps if not Quinn, some of my other friends. I blink, realizing I'm considering it. There are risks. Always risks with new games. Yet, for a moment, I can't help but think about what might be, before I shake my head and push it aside. Something to consider when I've done more research. For now, I've got to get logged in to deal with the problem in front of me. And I have to admit, Quinn's message might just have given me a new solution. I'm crouched next to the overpass, dressed to the nines. In my case, that means trench coat, guns, and black shirt and jeans. All kinds of goth trendy, but the game is just as much about image as it is effectiveness. Not to say that I'm not also wearing a bulletproof vest with stab-proof plates inserted underneath a shirt. I'm not a fan of getting shot, not when the damage mitigation of the armor can keep me up and my blood high. Target arriving in 5. Highlighting now. The voices crackle over my eardrums, the guards I've hired letting me know. I glance at the images that flicker across the AR glasses overlay, watching the semi ahead of me get highlighted. Security vehicle located. I spot the SUV, the quartet of guards driving behind a respectable and safe distance from the semi. Discreet. Smart. But not smart enough. Not when we've got all their details provided to us, including the license plate number of the escort vehicle. That's yours, Vlad. I don't even roll my eyes at the name, even if I want to. 10-4 here, blood. The voice is high-pitched and young, and almost at the same time, I see one of the cars driving on the interstate picking up speed, cutting across the lanes with as much subtlety as a cannonball to the front door. I twitch but stay silent. If Quinn was around, I'd definitely introduce him and Vlad. But he isn't, so I make do. The semi's getting closer and closer to the overpass, and I start judging distances and speed, even as I keep an eye on what's happening ahead of me. Doors are thrown open and Vlad throws himself across the space, punching through car windows and hauling metal doors open with a screech of metal. I roll my eyes a little, knowing the kind of commotion he's creating is going to cause trouble. But that's more than enough of a distraction to let me do my own thing, which involves dropping from the overpass and landing on the semi's trailer. I hit and roll, absorbing the shock and using one clawed hand to tear up the metal to keep on board. The physics engine gets a real workout, but thankfully, the rule of cool is in effect and I get to stay on. Top of trailer, run along to the front of the cabin and poke my head over, yank the door open and punch the driver out. Take over steering and get the entire thing back on course. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Yeah, I might have done all this a few times.
Woohoo! Did you see that? Bang! Ow! You shot me! I'm bleeding! Oh, you're bleeding? Let me just power up. 1 second.
I pull the earpiece out, not needing to hear further. Vlad will have his fun, and he'll lead the follow-up off in a wild goose chase. If he survives, I might even have another job for him. If he doesn't, well, he'll have one heck of a night, and I'll still have another job for him. It's kind of what I do. Once I get rid of the semi, which is simply a matter of arranging for the contents to be moved to another trailer in one of the many warehouses that are willing to do some off-the-books work, I've got the stolen cargo on its way to the next town over, to be sold off for a tidy profit. Stolen electronics for the most part are nothing particularly interesting, but a good chunk of change either way. More importantly, I also managed to interrogate the driver. He doesn't know a lot, but he knows enough for me to track down exactly who it is that owned the shipment. After that, a half-dozen calls later, and I'm ready to finish off this side project. Dram is not entirely happy that I resold the electronics, but he never asked me to keep it, so he has nothing to say. He's even less happy that I managed to track down the originator of the shipment, but again, he hasn't got a lot to say about it. I do trade details about Quinn's potential quitting for a 24-hour head start on that information and an address, which is why I'm walking into the building, bold as brass while doing a count of the half-dozen mooks he has arrayed around me. It's your standard office layout, version 13 to be exact, and so I know exactly where to go. Especially since Amos has, as everyone does, taken the top floor. More interestingly, none of his people try to stop me, even when I ignore them and ride the elevator up, going only so far as having 2 of them join me within. I'm nice enough to leave them alive, so that when I walk into his office, he's got 7 of them in play. All regular mooks, though minor deviations in their clothes and the weapons I glimpse tells me he has them upgraded at least a few times. Better weapons, better armor, probably better training. Translates to better reaction time and hit points. 7's a little much, even for me. Which is why I don't intend to let it devolve into a gunfight. Mr. Masters, Amos greets me with a smile. Handsome bastard. Tall, with a slightly elongated and pointed chin, and the stubble that says he's just a little bit of a bad boy, but not enough to be unsightly. The suit is tailor-made, the watch expensive and flashy. It's almost good enough to hide the bulletproof vest beneath. Amos Howe, I presume? I take in the rest of the room with a sweep of my eyes. 4 flanking him, hands resting in front so that they can grab for their weapons. The 2 who accompanied me stand right behind me. Windows right in front, floor to ceiling so that it shows the beautiful nighttime vista. Minimalistic modern decor, lots of glass and burnished steel, completely at odds with the pair of swords hanging to the side, next to the lounging chairs. I'd assumed you knew that before you barged in, Amos smiles, stepping out from behind the desk and standing there, hands wide. He's taller than me at 6'4". Doesn't say much about his real height, but he's moving with enough confidence that he's either been in game long enough to get used to the height differences, or he really is that tall in real life. Always good to check. I walk over to the lounging chairs, flopping down on one and splaying a little bit. It's arrogant as all hell, especially when I make sure to take up as much space as is comfortable. It also means that the pair of guns I keep holstered are in clear view, as are the custom silver stakes with wood cores right beneath them. Are you here to dust me, then? Amos says, watching me with a predator gaze. The guards tense, their AIs revving up at the mention of violence. Nah, if I intended that, I'd have my man send an RPG through your window while you were sitting there, I casually mention and watch him blanch. He can't help but glance back to the windows, but there's no signs. When he turns back, I keep speaking. No, I'm here to talk. Talk? That isn't the kind of reputation you have. I shrug elaborately and wait. Eventually, Amos comes over and sits down opposite me, and I have to keep my smile to myself. Now, he's dancing to my tune. So, let's start. Why me? I ask. We're in the same business, and I'm looking to expand. The man recovers quickly, being as blunt as I am in his replies. Good. Blunt is good. Hopefully that means he doesn't think he needs to posture any further. And if he does, well, we'll bloody that steak when we have to. One city not enough for you? Things are changing. You've got to grow or die these days. Or haven't you noticed? Amos says, a flicker of the person behind the act showing through. Not really. It ebbs and flows. Smart players learn to ride it out. except when there's a real tide change. I shrug in reply. How'd you think this would play out? You mess up a few of my plans while keeping your clients in your own city happy? Eventually start coming in with a few other bloods, all of them chirping how much better you are? Something like that, Amos says, hands opening wide. Surprised you're in the city at all, then, instead of coming in later. I slide my gaze over his people once more, making sure no one's doing a thing. Just business. Ah, yes. The usual requirements for establishing influence. I nod. That's one of the reasons why I haven't bothered to expand myself. Each city is its own world, and if you want to make any real changes or be able to exert any real influence, the rules of the game require you to do some of the things in person. Otherwise, it would let some of us older players have way too much power, being able to throw around money and power in cities without giving newer players a way to counteract us, even if that way is throwing themselves in swarms to kill on our characters. In fact, some of the most fun is when one city or another invades the other, with huge battles raging across the streets. Gang warfare with vampires in play can get a little insane. In fact, a few versions ago, that was part of the main storyline they pushed. Now, tell me, how did you think this visit was going to play out? Amos asks, leaning forward. I notice the way he shifts his body weight, ready to explode out of his seat if necessary. I ignore it, keeping my own weight relaxed and staying in full lounge mode. Thus far, neither one of us has used our gifts, triggering the power of our blood to play against one another. It'd be tricky, especially if I tried to use my influence on him. As another old-school blood, he's got quite a bit of influence in his city, but in this city, he doesn't. Pitching my own gift of command at him, forcing him to take an action I want might work in the short term, but it would be risky. It would also let him know the exact amount of influence I can bring to bear, which would give him information I'd rather keep hidden. It's the same for him. If he tries to command me to do something, he'd have to pitch his social influence against mine. More importantly, command is a short-term solution. He could shake it off within 10 minutes with minimal effort. I'd rather have a long-term solution. I figured I'd stroll in, have a chat with you, and convince you to leave my city alone. Or else, I trail off. Or else, I stop playing nice and end you, your minions. My eyes flick to his mooks. Your friends and your influence in your city. Ah, now that's more the Jonathan Masters I was told to expect. All violence and blood. There's a hint of distaste in his voice, like the violence is beneath him. It is quite straightforward, I shrug. Now, can I perhaps recommend a different job than mine? There's quite a few different roles we need filled. Kind of you to offer, but no. Amos shakes his head in denial. I much prefer being the deal maker. Deal maker, I sigh. You're one of those. And what does that mean? Amos demands. Nothing. No, tell me. You obviously have thoughts about this matter. He leans forwards and his minions shift, all of them turning back on again, after the last few exchanges where they had relaxed. It's eerie and weird and all too unnatural, which it obviously is. For all the processing power and programming they have with the varied movements and little ticks, if you spend enough time online, you pick out the little underlying logic. Making connections like we do, playing middleman and problem solver, guide and solution maker. I raise my hands, weighing unseen problems for everyone to watch in a cold, dispassionate office. You get a few kinds, some last longer than others. And deal makers don't, Amos sneers. I might not have been on as long as you, but I am no new blood. No, you're not, and I never said that, I say. Just that certain mindsets bring about certain results. For you, you make deals, bargains that keep you in the middle, like a spider pulling at strings. Putting my hands down, I shift forward. I do so casually, keeping my hands well in sight. Putting more weight forward, but not uncrossing a leg, making sure not to trigger the Mook's threat algorithms further. In fact, one of you guys actually said that to me before, described himself as a spider, pulling at strings of people, weaving intricate, important, elaborate traps. A spider, a rather mundane description, Amos sniffs, but you don't care for it. Not particularly, I shake my head. So, no chance of you choosing otherwise or leaving the city? None, he tenses, his hand moving a little to gesture to his people who all shift. some going so far as to put their hands into their jacket. The harsh light of the fluorescent bulbs glints off the chrome metal of the surroundings, and the tension ratchets up. I nod. Amos twitches a little, almost in anticipation of me making a move. But I don't. I just sit there entirely still. His people are uncertain, poised to move but not receiving the signal to do so. We're in a stalemate, neither making a move. He's concerned about his influence, his prestige. Acting first will lower it, make it harder for him to establish himself in the city. Same for me, though I've got both more to lose and less concern since I have that much more. Silence like cut glass extends, ratcheting up like a blade hovering a neck, waiting to lower but held aloft. Amos shifts, his eyes darting from me around the room after a few seconds, unable to just sit. I keep my own attention fixed on him, but keep my eyes relaxed, letting peripheral vision do all the work. Eventually he breaks. "Is that it? Threats but no actual action?" I grin and stand. The movement is fast and smooth, graceful even. Guns swing out, but still the mooks don't fire. I'm a little sad, since that means he's got their threat algorithms locked down hard. You don't get that same level of control with your standard mooks, but as I noted before, he'd upgraded them. Amos, on the other hand, is sprawled back, having jerked himself away only to realize I'm not attacking. I'm a little surprised his reactions are that bad. Most long-term players have pretty damn decent combat instincts, but he's closer to what I'd call a mundane. While he splutters and tries to grab control, I just walk towards the elevator. As much as I swagger over to the elevator, affecting an unconcerned attitude, this is the most dangerous moment. If he chooses to have his people shoot me in the back, it would be painful, potentially lethal if I don't catch it in time. I can't even activate any gifts because anything but social gifts would trigger combat protocols and lose me the influence standoff. Then again, letting me just swagger out of this room is as bad for him as not shooting me. The question is, how much he's willing to risk. When the elevator doors slide open and I step in, I can't help but let out a little relieved breath. Turning around, I see him glaring at me, his fingers twitching a little. He's probably planning 1,000,001 ways to attack me and my resources, my allies and holdings. But rather than trade words with me further, he lets the elevator doors slide closed and take me down. I'll admit, I gave him a little wave just as the doors close. The explosion comes as I'm getting into my car at the entrance of the building. The rocket trails can just be spotted, all 2 of them. Not that I was particularly worried. He might have purchased bulletproof glass, but the rockets we used aren't meant to punch through tank armor and deliver their payload afterwards. Glass and heat wash down from above, the shrill scream of car alarms going off all around. The guards at the door are reacting with confusion and anger, a couple pulling weapons on me. I ignore them, closing the door and watch as the car slides away smoothly. I won't keep him down, not for long. He could lose his entire security contingent that he brought to the city and still not feel a thing. As for himself, he'll respawn in a week. In the meantime, he'll have time to play his alts, plan his revenge, and even explore ways of harming me in secret. More than one Eternal has come back from a death with enough information and plans to turn a battle around. Of course, that's why I made a few calls. First of them to the Eternal whose semi I hit. They were particularly annoyed with me, but were understanding enough when they realized it was just business. Especially when I provided them details not just about who provided the information, but about how Amos planned to make use of it. Carlos was more than happy to confirm that Amos was working with his competitors once more. In turn, he was more than happy to give me a few details about both Amos and his competitor, so that he could pay them back. The fact that I was willing to do it at a discount probably sold matters to him. Then there were the calls to the new bloods I'd met at Charlotte's ball. Out of the 4, 2 of them were more than happy to move to a new city since they had yet to establish themselves here, especially since they had such a sweet line of companies and businesses that could be taken over. As for the other 2, well, a little research on my end during the day with my own contacts had shown the kind of places Amos was trying to get his tenterhooks into. The thing about going after companies, which in most cases are abandoned account properties created when a character is first installed, is that it also makes those companies vulnerable for exploitation by others. In most cases, such actions involve going after individuals already compromised in said organizations, whether through blackmail, favors, intimidation, or just good old bribery. Once exploited, It's easy enough to work backwards and do it again, even going so far as to move your own pieces into place. It just depends on when and how. Which is what I leave to the new bloods to do. They're more than happy to have targets, ones that I'm even able to provide some little guidance on, but to work the entire problem themselves. That is, after all, why they joined the game. And do it well enough, I might even owe them a little. In the week that Amos is down, he's going to be hitting multiple locations both in his city and mine. And more importantly, he gets to learn one particularly important thing about being a spider. It doesn't matter how strong your webs are or how extensive you lay your network. If your opponent decides to bring a flamethrower to the party, you better be fire retardant. I log out of the game early, once I'm sure everything is in play. It's not a bad couple of days. The fight between me and Amos isn't finished, but none of it ever really finishes. That's kind of part and parcel of the game. Eventually, he'll either lose enough money and influence to call it off, or I'll have to keep tracking him down and killing him. Eventually, he'll call it a day. Or he'll manage to do the same to me. But that's the game for you. It's not running around hunting down mobs or leveling up your character. Not anymore. Sure, I feed and build up my influence, make friends and trade favors, like the one I owe Charlotte for the introductions and removing 2 of the new bloods from the city. But in the end, it is about politicking and outmaneuvering your enemies, of walking out of a building while it explodes, cloak billowing in the sudden onrush of wind, of making a name for yourself, one that rings so true and loud that even Eternals in other cities whisper about it. That's Eternal Night for you. As I lie in bed, I grab my phone and get tapping. It doesn't take long before the message is written and sent. It's short and simple, because why wouldn't it be? Thanks for thinking about me, man, but I think I'm sticking around for a while longer. You take care. P.S. I promise not to take too big a bite off your properties in the next month if you do change your mind. Chuckling, I toss the phone aside and close my eyes. As I do so, the lights flicker and go out. My emergency batteries kick in, keeping the important things running without a beat, but everything else dies. A tilt of my head shows the dark vista outside, every other building dark too. Blackout. I sigh and wait, counting off in my head. 28 seconds later, and the lights come back on as the batteries fed by our solar array turn on. Not much later, a few other buildings light up too, as their own emergency generators and batteries cut in. I grin as the lights glow above me, knowing that Andre got the panels working. Closing my eyes, I drift off, content to sleep, knowing tomorrow there's going to be another, longer day. More plots, more plans, more blood. And probably another mini crisis in the building. The end. You've been listening to Another Day, Another Plot, a vampire lit RPG story, written by Tao Wong, narrated by Derek Scholes. Production copyright by Starlit Productions, 2021.
Blood Knowledge, an Eternal Night story, written by Tao Wong, performed by Joe Hempel. Dram watched as Masters left his office, keeping an eye on his security monitors until the player's avatar had finally left the building. The troublemaker was always bringing new problems to his doorstep, demanding that he provide information at lower than normal rates. Realistically, he really should have said no. But Masters also brought quite a bit of business his way. And anyways, it was good to have an in with someone who was as blunt as the claws that he used. Of course, he had to admit the fact that someone was making a move against Masters meant that things were going to get bloody. The man seemed to think that he was a political player, a smooth operator of some sort. In reality, the only reason no one had ever taken him out was because Masters was really just that good at getting things done, whether it was taking out troublesome players or managing new vampires as they arrived. Add on to that his first mover advantage, and really, trying to deal with Jonathan Masters was just too much trouble for what it was worth for most people. He knew things were going to get heated, especially now that Masters was intent on taking action. More importantly, whatever he chose to do, it would have ramifications on the individuals, not just in this city, but other locations as well. Whatever was going on, it likely had something to do with the latest release. Every time an update happened, well, things changed. Reputations and digital fortunes were lost and made each update, with the livelihood and career of professional players always in jeopardy at those times. It'd be worrisome if the developers did a gun gala and gated certain weapons via monthly subscription fees. That one move had killed a third of their player base, made professional players who resold their weapons persona non grata, and left the shooter gaming community reeling for 2 years. Eternal Night, for all its flaws, was relatively stable. It had a dedicated fan base as mid-tier game. Of course, like any middling company, they had designs on growing bigger, which meant drastic changes could and would happen. And Dram really was not looking forward to actually finding a real job, especially since he had almost no useful real-world skills or contacts. All that meant he had a lot of work to get done now, as among other things, everyone would start coming to him for more information. That probably also explained why he bothered to keep in contact with Masters. Like a canary in the coal mine, the vampire had a tendency to catch whiff of new problems faster than anyone else. And since Dram was his preferred supplier, it meant he caught wind of things before anyone else. All of which left him and his various competitors with a lot more work. He glanced down at his keyboard for a second and then looked up to his computer monitors, pulling up his contacts and sending out this tidbit of information to everyone. More importantly, he started the process of dragging them online. Emergency meetings were always hard to organize, especially since nearly half of the players were still out. One of the reasons most people chose to play an information broker was because it required so little actual time in the game itself. Set up the right connections, buy the right secondary programs and contacts, make sure you reviewed your offline parameters for the avatar, and all that information would flow in with minimal problems. The longer you stayed out, of course, the more information the game would dump into you, which was why most regular players would ensure they logged in at least once a day, even if for nothing other than some basic maintenance. Once you did that and reviewed the data, you could hang out with your friends and just play Power Broker. It also meant that they were one of the strongest organizations within the game. After all, if everyone was only part-time, there weren't a lot of egos to deal with. This was played for fun, not for money. And while there were egomaniacs, the nature of being a power broker meant that contacts were important, and anyone who pissed off enough players eventually found themselves frozen out. Not that that impacted Dram very much. After all, he was a full-time player. Had to be, what with his issues in the real world. Better to be here, considered ugly and unwanted, than out there and be considered, well, ugly and unwanted. For a second, Dram's leg jittered. Nervous, rocking energy transferred to a stupid neural tic. He froze as he realized what he was doing and shook his head. No. Here he was Dram. Unwanted, perhaps, ugly certainly, but ugly only in a game sense. More than one assignation had been completed and finished because, well, VR ugly was not the same as real-world ugly. Or something. He had no idea about how people thought, men or women. His leg stopped moving. He forced himself to breathe and relax. In any case, he was Dram here, and he had power, respect, money, and most of all, contacts. Fingers flew across the keyboard, sending out messages to all the other power brokers. Soon enough, he started receiving replies, some confirming information received, others indicating they would look into it further. He read through the messages, and once they started slowing, he leaned back. The question was, what else to do? And really, at the end of the day, the answer was simple. Get moving. Of course, he was a 𝗪𝗏𝗏, named after that old movie. They even modeled much of the makeup and character models off the main character, giving them a flat, smooth head and long ears as well as eyes that were a little too wide. The truth was, they didn't look human at all, which was ostensibly the major drawback of choosing the 𝗪𝗏𝗏 bloodline in the game. What the creators hadn't realized, while creating a system in game that was so true to life, was that it also left a huge exploit. Making his way over to an adjacent side room, Dram proceeded to open his wardrobe drawers, scanning through his makeup kit. Quite a few makeup artists had actually joined the game, picking the 𝗪𝗏𝗏 and using the character models as a way to practice their work while playing a game. He wasn't a professional, of course, but there were quite a number of forums, videos, and documents detailing the best methods. After all this time, multiple years doing this, He'd grown a rather deft hand at applying the makeup. First came the bronzer, a little coloring, little change to the ears via some prosthetics and tape. Then the wig, alterations on the eyebrows and slope of the forehead via applied latex skin, some cheek implants, and even a small, wispy goatee. That was all that was needed to transform him from a very clear and unnatural being to just a normal, though somewhat ugly, human. Grinning into the mirror, Dram gave himself a quick nod and stood up. Time to go. One of the things about dealing with the question of whether someone was going after Masters was the ultimate why. Of course, everyone knew that it had to do with the game update. But what the update actually included, no one exactly knew yet. Oh, there were 1,000,000,001 different theories running around on the internet, everyone somehow feeling that they had their inside scoop on this. Dram knew, though, that the company was extremely vigilant about letting any information leak from the outside. That didn't mean he didn't understand that there were information leaks on the inside, little hints that the company purposefully left in their minor updates, information that was passed on to their own NPCs to make sure that the players who knew about how the game was played could set themselves up for future success. Over the multiple versions that Dram had played, there were more than a few players who had managed to make their name by correctly guessing what the next evolution of the game would be. Positioning yourself way in advance to make the most of an update could easily make a vampire, or just as easily break them. As for himself, he wasn't one of those lore masters. Dram's focus had always been figuring out what the players were currently doing. That didn't mean he was entirely in the dark about the rumors of upcoming changes, but he did leave it for others to figure out before he swooped in and paid for their hard-earned knowledge. Even so, with new moves being made, it was clear he was behind the curveball this night. It was not a position he enjoyed being in, which meant he needed to get active. In this case, there were a few people he knew who were likely to know something. All of that was a long way of saying he was out and about this night, leaving his much vaunted, highly protected residence. He hated doing that, really, but even now, going out as Dram instead of his meat body was different. He couldn't exactly put a finger to it, and it still drained him mentally and emotionally to interact with others even in the game. Still better than real life. It probably said something about his world and himself, that if someone had really cared, they would probably have had a chat with him about therapy. Luckily, Dram didn't have friends or family in that sense. None at least who would have noticed the fact that he had not actually left his apartment other than to toss the garbage away in over 2 months. Maybe it was because he was a fellow introvert that 𝗂𝗄𝗃 actually let him in. He listened as the metal door slid open, the gates pivoting on smooth pistons, allowing him entrance into her high-rise condo. Set in the middle of the city, it had one of the best views he had ever seen, a full 360-degree observation of the world below. It amused him, really, that it was an introvert vampire that owned the most expensive piece of real estate that he personally had entered. Even in game worlds, it was a staggering level of cost that beggared his own mansion on the edges of the city. And unlike 𝗂𝗃𝗃, he had land. Even more amusing, it was not as if she would ever make use of it during the day when sunlight streamed in and would cook her vampire body. UV shielding and curtains could only do so much, even when the game made some allowances to ensure that players could play during the daytime. What were vampires if they could go out in daylight? Well, he knew the answer to that one, and they were called fangers. Looked down upon by the majority of serious players, though, of course, they had their own subculture in Eternal Night. In fact, Dram had to admit they probably were a larger percentage of the gaming population than the Bloods like him. Still, he paid little attention to them since their intrigues, their method of playing, bisected his own business little. As he strode in, Dram found 𝗂𝗄𝗃 lounging, looking over the city below as she browsed the web and had a chat with someone in her living room. Dram flicked his gaze over the other gentleman, marking name and face and bearing. It didn't take long to figure out that he was human. The beat of his heart, the human stink, was quite present and noticeable. He assumed he was another one of her blood dolls, another one of her tendrils reaching out into the city. Dram worked with individuals and vampires, real ones. 𝗂𝗃𝗃 worked with the game system, using blood dolls and paid informants all over the city to give her the same level of information. Of course, what she wanted and what she was interested in was really the lore of the world. It was why entire sections of this penthouse was dedicated to her library, the accumulated knowledge that she'd acquired over the last 3 major version updates of the game. Those version updates had been interesting. The first had been the expansion of the cities, going from a few major cities per time zone to almost a dozen major locations all across the major time zones. That expansion had been one of necessity, with a series of other minor updates, including the first introduction of the daytime logged off series. The second version update had added smaller villages and cities, a location for those who wanted to replicate certain popular book series in the game and those who had no desire to fight for control in the bigger cities. The third major update had added even more cities, floating locations, and the influence system, along with a large number of new bloodlines that had been expanded. At that point, the daytime avatar mods had reached its current status, in all the major ways at least. "Dram, what is it that you want?" 𝗪𝗂 said upon seeing him fully enter. "Right to the point as usual," Dram said. "Would you have it any other way?" "No. It's very refreshing, really, after dealing with all of the others." Dram took a seat, knowing that she would never actually offer him one. "I'm actually here about the upcoming update. I'm getting the feeling that this isn't just another city or another set of influencers or new bloodlines. This seems to be a major one. And, of course, you think I know what it's going to be. Or at least have a clue." 𝗪𝗂 laughed, then shook her head at Dram. "I have nothing definitive. And anyway, you think you're the only one looking for this information? What do you think? That I would let you know over anyone else?" Because you know I'll pay well for whatever information you do acquire?" Dram had to smile, flashing her his fangs. "You know me so well." "So?" she asked. Dram reached into the messenger bag he'd been carrying. He pulled the wrapped item out, one redolent with rot and mold. He hated parting with the item, though he had scanned every single page beforehand. Still, the original item was the only thing that would do with collectors like 𝗪𝗂. He gently placed the book on the table, lifting the cloth covering. 𝗪𝗂 stared at the book, leaning forwards until the system finally gave her some details. Then she let out a little gasp, instinctively reaching for it. Dram pulled the book a little away, more of a reminder than an actual attempt at taking it aside. After all, she never made it all the way across the space between them. The movement was enough to halt 𝗪𝗂's aborted actions, though she couldn't help licking her lips in hunger. That's an original translation of the Blood Chronicles by Evan Carl, isn't it? You authenticated it, right?" 𝗪𝗂 said. "Of course you did. You wouldn't bring it to me if it wasn't." Dram smiled thinly, knowing that he had her. 𝗪𝗂 sighed in agreement and nodded to Dram. "Fine. As I said, I don't know anything for sure. But there's been a lot of rumblings about wild dogs, about small settlements being taken over, vampires disappearing. A lot of NPCs have been culled, the ones that travel between cities or that lived in or moved out to small towns. It almost seems like they're trying to push all of us into the major hubs." Dram frowned. That made no sense. The game was doing well, not great, but not horribly. Player population had stabilized. Profits probably weren't bad either, though maybe they were trying to reduce server load? That would make sense on the meta perspective. Then again, wouldn't it make current players upset? He shook his head, repeating her other statements. "Wild dogs? Well, come on if you know your meta lore." Son of a bitch, Dram swore as he realized what she was getting at. "I did not sign up for that kind of game." 𝗪𝗂 sighed. "Me neither, but they'll do what they want to do." Dram sat back, considering his next steps. This was a big change. So big that he wasn't entirely sure he could trust the news from 𝗪𝗂 alone. After all, even she had said that she was uncertain that this was true. Rumors weren't reality, after all. Maybe... Dram looked down, then pushed the book forwards before standing up. "I want your sources, and all the details, obviously. Any additional confirmation or news that you get pertaining to this." 𝗃𝗺𝗃 just nodded, waving away 𝗃. He chuckled as he walked off, catching her lunging for the book the moment he'd moved away from it. He figured he'd get the actual information later that day when the system kicked her out and she had to set up her avatar to do some offline tasks. In the meantime, he had others to talk to. Asking questions, knocking on doors, speaking to those who should be in the know. That was all that 𝗃 did for the next few hours, porting between destination to destination, his character put on autopilot every time he had to travel. Of course, the actual travel time between locations was a lot faster than it would have been in the real world, since no one joined a game to spend the majority of their time gaming in traffic, going from location to location. Even then, to help create the gameplay elements of being in a city, travel time was part of the game. All of which meant that 𝗃 found himself logging into the game forums a lot, perusing threads that he had initially dismissed. There were a lot of threads by noobs and spammers and just your general pranksters, all of them insisting that they had some special insight into the upcoming update. The vast majority he could easily dismiss, either being really bad update ideas. No, they weren't going to be introducing hunters with, silver swords, and dumpiers who could walk through daylight or add in the option to play in the Dark Ages. All of that would just be broken or entirely too expensive. And of course, there was no way in high heavens the developers would introduce something as dumb as ghosts. Who wanted to play a character that couldn't interact with everyone else except in very specific circumstances? The kind of gameplay value on such an addition would be incredibly low, especially for the sheer volume of resources it would require. Still, for all of that, 𝗃 did find a few nuggets of information that might be considered substantiation over 𝗃𝗄𝗃's insinuation. For example, traveling vampires who asserted that certain stops on their regular route, which used to be perfectly fine, were now barred to them. Whether it was because their characters received a strange feeling that they weren't supposed to go there while automated and their avatars replotted to a new city, or in a few cases, when they pushed it while they were in-game, they were sent straight to respawn. Areas of influence suddenly disappearing, shrinking down as smaller cities disappeared from call lists, contacts and individuals no longer answering. There were even indications that certain players who had taken over smaller cities were finding themselves sent to respawn, awakening with their houses destroyed, their lairs shattered, all of which resulted in the players and their characters being forced into the main cities. Influence, blood dolls, resources were all changing on a subtle level, one that resulted in certain vampires thinking they had a chance at either expanding or needing to do so, rumblings of which 𝗃 himself had seen, though he had taken it to be caused by just the ebb and flow of vampiric politics. There was even an entire article about someone being told stories of shifters and other weird creatures that inhabited the night during an evening-long soiree hosted by a well-known NPC vampiric duke in his mansion. Stronger, faster, more powerful than any vampire. 𝗃 kind of figured that was propaganda, of course, historical and world-building notes to pump it all up. Chances were the developers would balance the two races out. After all, no one wanted to play a species that would be significantly underpowered. Which meant, of course, 𝗃 was knocking on doors trying to find people who he should be talking to. "Richard, been meaning to talk to you," 𝗃 said, listening as his call was connected. One finger rested on the floating table that let him browse the forums, the other hand holding up the phone. Always nice to have drivers. In the background of the call, he could hear the play of waves on the water, the shriek of a seagull that was still up even this late at night. Amazing how detailed the game was, even for something as simple as a phone call. "𝗃, there a problem with the report I sent?" "Nah, the wharf details were good." What he didn't mention was that he had only one buyer now, ever since Lynette had quit the game. Her NPC avatar had cut down on such expenses when it took over, leaving the avatar more vulnerable. The usual routine, the NPCs would take care of the interest groups, resources, and blood dolls the player directly owned. But anything outside of that and any concerted efforts to take it all away was not guarded against. It allowed new players ways to go after already owned locations with less risk while also keeping older avatars in play. such that if a player picked up the game again, they did not necessarily have to start from zero. But none of that was Richard's problem. He ran a small gang, playing hardcore vampires in the Wharf group, throwing their weight around and fighting a couple of other local gangs. There were a consistent flow of quests down in the Wharf, from drug smuggling, human trafficking, body disposals, and ranging NPC vampire groups who might come in to cause problems. Never mind the interactions between the NPC police and Wharf authorities, the hunts that might impact the area and the homeless who hid around abandoned warehouses. "So what's the call about then?" said Richard. Right. Been getting more new vampires coming in? Controlled or not?" "Yeah, now that you mention it. Refugees, some coming in from other coastal locations. There's rumblings that there's some new monster on the seas too, taking out floating hives. Think you can ask around for me? Get more details about these new monsters or what drove those people out? What do I get about it? Double the usual rate?" "Double, eh?" Richard paused. Then Dram could almost see the smile across the line. "Well, that sounds very good." "Great. You know how to contact me." Dram exchanged a few more pleasantries and clarified the scope before closing the line. He looked around, realizing that they had come to a stop against a nightclub. Vampiric nightclubs, hidden in warehouses or under retail stores, were all the rage. Not that Dram ever liked visiting them. Partly because, as he strode in after being let through the damn solid metal doorway, of them, the vampires that clustered these environs. The heavy beat of club music, all bass and rhythm, rang through the underground locale, the constant press of figures highlighted by the UV and colored strobe lights. There was a wide array of colors and clothing on display, though black and skimpy predominated. More than a few individuals sported collars and tattoos, marks of ownership from one fanger or another. And it was a fanger-heavy crowd, Dram could tell. That was, after all, the point of these things. It was here that those who indulged in casual play hung out the most, reenacting bad Interview with the Vampire or Blade movie scenes, lusting over figures and trying for a level of cool they might never reach in real life. Harmless romance, a chance for individuals to practice flirting. Even if 3/4 of the blood dolls in here were NPCs, the romance and interaction routines built into the software were quite complex at this time. Multiple interactions, multiple responses, all recorded over thousands of hours of gameplay and consolidated into a machine learning routine. All of which led to, "Hey babe, you're looking smoking tonight," followed by a long, low grin by a spiky-haired, leather-bedecked fanger. No verbal response, just the roll of the eyes by the pretty goth blood doll preceded by a flip of the hair. Then she stalked off only to be grabbed by the arm, turned towards another. "You bothering you, babe? Don't worry, I've got you back. Maybe a drink?" Another smile, another attempt. This one went better, though Dram noted the flicker in the fanger's eyes, the use of a blood skill. Not his business. Let them play. Figure out how to interact and flirt with women, NPCs or not. He did note how the real players were more popular, how men and women clustered around those blood dolls in eager anticipation. Idly, Dram flicked through his mental Rolodex, putting names to faces for some of them, taking snapshots of others for additional research later. Fangers moved in and out of the game so fast it was often hard to keep track of. Now, where was... there? On a raised stage, to the right, was the DJ table. Behind it, another player, playing tunes, controlling the dance floor, raising the roof. Or did the kids even use that anymore? Dram had to believe there were new terms, but what with the majority of his daily interactions either online or media from television and audio sticks, he was rather behind. Crossing the edge of the dance floor, pushing through the groups, he kept his head down, hoping he could get a word in with one of his few contacts that kept the beat of the finger groups. Pun intended. "Look who's here!" A hand barred his way, slick polyester shirt covering a pale hand. The voice was raised, but not fully shouting, one of the game's minor alterations on reality to allow actual speech in a dance floor, when everyone would have been shouting or screaming their voices hoarse. "Hmm?" Dram looked up and was too late to hide the wince. The man standing before him in his purple shirt and sunglasses in a club, had long blonde hair so light it might even be white. His shirt was unbuttoned nearly to his diaphragm, the pale ripple of androgynous, flat muscles showing beneath. Unfortunately, the man and his 3 companions were all well known to the vampire. "Gordy!" "Gordon," said the man. "What are you doing here, Ugly?" "Really? Ugly? That's the best you can come up with?" Dram said, shaking his head. He pushed sideways, trying to get around the arm. "None of your business." Gordon surged forward, blocking Dram off even as he signaled his friends. Idly, Dram scanned the group, noting only one other was actually there. The other 2 were running offline avatar programs, though they were all player characters. So he wasn't outnumbered 4-1, just 2-1, since the offline defaults would push them away from fighting. Even if they did turn off the combative defaults, their actual ability to engage in combat was lousy. Then again, fighting in the middle of a crowded nightclub, vampire hangout or not, was a bad idea. "I'm talking to you, sewer breath." Gordon leaned in, sticking his nose bare inches from Dram. "Your kind aren't wanted here." Dram rolled his eyes. That only infuriated the other player, who moved a hand upwards, only for Dram to catch at it. "Don't. You know what happens if we get into a fight here," Dram hissed. "And while I don't care about being banned, I don't think the same holds true for you, does it?" Gordon froze for a second, eyes snapping down. "You think you can set others on me? Mess with my women and get away with it? You think you can flaunt your ugly mug in here and just saunter out?" "Firstly, I sell information. You want to know who caused you problems? Just ask. If you want to know the best way to hurt them, just ask. Not that it would matter. After all, the people that had bothered Gordy here had left for another city over 2 months ago. Then again, holding grudges was what the internet was best at. I don't differentiate, I just sell. It's my job." "I'm just following orders," Gordon replied, raising his voice into a high and whining one. "Heard that one before." Dram narrowed his eyes and then shook his head, bending a little and pushing forwards. No point arguing. At some point, it just stopped making sense to do so. Better to just, get on with it. He pushed in, shoulder turning to push against the other. Surprised by the change, Gordon stumbled back a little, only to catch himself. He growled, fangs dropping down a little. But the gap was just enough for Dram to squeeze around him. A hand dropping on his shoulder was shed as he let himself twist and drop downwards. And then Dram was past the blockade, squeezing past a pair of girls and a server. A pull on his bloodline ability, and Dram faded into the background. Shadows pulled around his body as the game helped shroud his presence. It took him a few steps further and squeezing into a corner before he was truly safe, while the group hurried around trying to find him, making a mess of it. The vampires watched as security arrived, dealing with the disruptive group and tossing them out of the nightclub for the night. Smirking a little, Dram detached himself from the shadows, letting his blood fade away, idly noting the flashing icon in the corner indicating a need to feed. Well, talk to Spinner first. God, gamers were horrible at naming conventions sometimes. Spinner for a DJ. Talk to Spinner, then go feed. Then keep looking, because as amusing as this interaction had been, he still had a job to do and a rumor to verify. One that might just make him a decent chunk of change and increase his reputation. The conversation with the DJ had gone about as well as could be hoped for. Dram had to wait for nearly 20 minutes before Spinner took a break, at which point a quick and hushed conversation had revealed the Fangers had seen nothing. Not that they called themselves that, but the answer was the same anyway. They had not noticed. So, another dead end. He had, of course, left instructions to keep an ear out. Then he had slipped out, carefully watching for potential trouble. Luckily, the fools had moved on rather than try to find him and continue their conversation. For a second, as he waited for his car to come around, Dram considered hiring someone to beat some sense into them. That was the way it was done, after all. Someone like Masters, or probably someone cheaper, would do. Sending their characters off to respawn once or twice, and they'd learn their lesson. Then Dram dismissed it. Those kind of actions could have unforeseen consequences to his business. No, he was a neutral party. That was what he had said, and no matter what, he had to play it that way. Climbing into the car, Dram glanced at his clock and sighed. For the first time, Dram found himself with nothing better to do than feed before he was to meet another. They were still on the way, just so that he didn't have to wait. But it was going to be at least an hour or more before his next contact was meant to meet up with him. He debated taking a few minutes offline, grabbing a drink and a snack in the real world and stretching his body. After all, keeping himself healthy was important, especially when half his day meant lying in bed staring into the void. Right now, he was in the middle of browsing through another thread that was insinuating a number of humorous and lewd acts that the developers could do, rebalancing the poster's favorite bloodline abilities in the most recent update. Half the people commenting were just taking side bets on how long before the original poster's account was muted or even banned. That was when the entire car lurched to the side. Metal shrieked, the entire car tipping over as the powerful forces in play kicked in. He tumbled, along with the vehicle, over and over with the car's body compressing and bending, glass shattering, his entire body jerking as the seatbelt pulled against him and kept him tied down. Dram's head spun, crown knocking against the sides of the car. A vertigo and minor concussion debuff popped up in his screen. Seconds later, the software fed the very same sensations to his body, throwing his sense of balance off, making him feel like he was drunk. For obvious reasons, the company wasn't going to go and give him a brain injury, so this was their version of it. It took him a while once the vehicle came to a stop, Dram upside down and hanging on only by the simple canvas item. Eventually, fumbling fingers just gave up, and he yanked the entire metal apparatus apart using his intense bloodline-gifted strength to do so. After all, he was a vampire even if he wasn't exactly geared to combat. With Dram landing on his neck, the software threw another series of debuffs at him, making him lurch to the side and rebalance against the upside-down upholstery. Heh, upholstery. Upside down. Biting his lip, Dram slammed energy down his body, sending the healing aspects of his vampiric body into overdrive. The debuff cleared, giving him a clear sense of what was happening at last. Someone like Masters, that big lout that he was, would likely have exploded out guns blazing, ready to do battle. That was his thing, after all. He might have been as blunt as a 200-year-old training sword, but the vampire knew how to fight. It was one of the reasons why he'd lasted as long as he had. Dram, on the other hand, had spent most of his gaming time behind the desk, or in a few cases over a cup of warm blood. No, he wasn't going to head out like a fool. He wasn't geared to fight, but he did have his own abilities. Another breath, a quick overview of his blood tank. Not a lot, not enough. First steps, he grabbed the insulated bottle within, popping open the cap to down the emergency blood. It took him back up to 3/4 of his resource pack, and if the blood tasted a little like lukewarm curry, well, it was what it was. Next, he tapped into Shadow, the bloodline ability for his kind, and faded into the darkness. Even looking down upon himself, he could barely see where he was, and he knew that for any other player he would be as good as invisible. He might not have a lot of skills, unlike some, but he dedicated a heck of a lot of his points to a few specialized abilities. Who needs to fight when you can run? On the other hand, he was in an upside-down car with bad guys probably on the way. Even as Dram finished considering that fact and put himself fully on his feet, the door leading to the nearest side where they had hit him started shrieking in protest. Already buckled metal further twisted and ripped, forcing Dram to stare in incredulity. Exactly how many points had that idiot put into vigor? He briefly debated a few options before pulling out the roadside flare that he always kept with him. Pulling it close, he waited until the door was entirely wrenched open and he could see outside. Something big, something hairy, and something very, very angry was waiting outside. Definitely not a vampire. More like a big dog, or maybe a wolf. Shit. Dram lurched outside, trusting in his ability to work as he scrambled forwards. He was 3/4 of the way out before the creatures sniffed the air and turned towards where he was. Scent. The vampire cursed, knowing that his ability might have been compromised. But that was what the flare was for. Striking it with a swift motion, he then shoved it straight into a creature's mouth while it was still reacting to the fact that light had just bloomed and a vampire had appeared right next to his face. Shadow Body was powerful, but the bloodline ability did have some disadvantages, including offensive actions making it less potent. Dram's hand went 2/3 of the way in, shoving the blazing phosphorus flare into the creature's mouth. The beast yowled in pain, and it reflexively clamped down on his arm. Dram, of course, proceeded to drop the weapon even as the system sent pain notices to him. Another twist, a clawed hand catching his thigh as he was lifted and tossed aside by the hairy monster's powerful neck muscles. Long claws shredded his suit and his muscles beneath, even as he arced through the air, the monster clawing and hacking at its throat a second later. Once more tumbling through the air, the vampire bounced off the ground, nearly hit a passing car, and then fetched up against the sidewalk. Light from nearby lamplights glowed, displaying the scene of the accident, the growing pool of curious passersby. Stupid masquerade AI routines. Arm bleeding, Dram scrambled backwards, finding a pool of darkness near a parked car and fading into it as the combat countdown ticked down, leaving him in the shadows once more. Once the damn combat countdown disappeared, he would be fully hidden, and he could run. Even if the monster could scent him, it had to have a debuff after having its throat and nose singed. Or he hoped, at least. Then again, running wasn't going to tell him what the monster was. And since Mohammed had been trying to go to the mountain and the mountain had arrived, he might as well greet it properly. Hairy wolf. Monster. Werewolf. Shifting to the side, watching as the creature finally plucked the roadside flare out of its throat and threw it aside, and then howled, Dram took a number of screenshots, forcing the system to record all of this for him. He couldn't, of course, use this in the game, but there was nothing stopping him from showing it as offline verification. It was one of those things where you could metagame the entire information selling business. Of course, you didn't want to do that too much, otherwise the entire company would come down on you. Still, in moderation, it worked well. More importantly, Dram was no longer near where the creature had first seen him, while he waited to see what the monster would do next. He was far enough away that he should have trouble finding him, and the unleashing of a couple of simple pepper packets where he last was ensured that his scent was going to be mixed up a little. Not perfect, but a good start. After all, scent was one of those things that he'd had to deal with even with other vampires, if much less often, so he had his own method of handling it. The creature obviously was significantly more sensitive to his smell, though, which made sense, since it was a werewolf. Come out, wherever you are, you little blood bag. I'm going to eat you and get my quest points. Dram rolled his eyes, but he was kind of glad for the taunting. If he was a player and this was a quest line, it wasn't an NPC-generated problem. That also meant that it was definitely an update coming with these creatures. Of course, the question was why a player who had access to a new character race was coming and bothering Dram now. Everything that he'd heard indicated that they were in the outskirts, not the main cities. What do you want? Why me? Dram called out, making sure to project his voice away from him and off the sewer grate. Ventriloquism was a very useful skill to learn. He'd been trying to learn it in real life, but without the computer software taking over and basically doing it for him for the most part, it was a lot harder. Unfortunately, the shifter might be new and rather talkative, but he wasn't stupid. He didn't jump at the voice, he just stalked around, sniffing at the air. You're just a quest, little vampire. Came down a few hours ago since you bloodsuckers don't know when to stop asking questions. A little laugh, one that cut through the night and chilled Dram's blood. It was hungry, predatory. A part of Dram, the rational part, had to give the developers credit. It was bloody scary. You keep asking questions, and I keep having to go and put all of you down. Dram frowned at the implication. One hand on the ground, the other caressed the insides of his jacket and the objects within. You've had to kill a few of us, then? More than a few. Of course, I got to travel a little bit and do that, but it doesn't really matter. You all think you're so smart, with all your bloodline abilities and all your skills, and really you're just prey. When he finished speaking, the shifter spun on the balls of his feet and lunged, headed straight for Dram. Dram snorted, dropping low and shoving his hand straight. He might not be a fighter, but he certainly knew better than to go and throw himself at an unseen target, trusting surprise to carry the day. He'd been in enough scuffles to know that not all of his abilities would work all the time. Yanking out the stake and holding it before him at an angle was a matter of moments. He watched as the silver-tipped, ashen body stake sank deep into the creature's chest. It buckled a little in his hand, almost slipping out under the sheer force of the other monster's momentum. Another arm, raised a little, and his head hidden under the raised shoulder all got clipped by the flailing arms, drawing streaks of blood and tearing skin open. Dram had been old school, having started playing when all the rumors about the different kinds of vulnerabilities between vampires had been par for the course. No one really knew what was real, what was fake, especially with all the different bloodline vulnerabilities. Among the discussions had been that of silver being particularly dangerous. Of course, that rumor had been disproved a while ago. There were, of course, a couple of bloodlines that were particularly vulnerable to having silver used on them, but really, put anything through the heart and most vampires dropped. The additional costs of adding silver to a stake just weren't worth it, which was why silver-tipped stakes had grown out of favor. Except for people like Dram, who'd picked up his own armament ages ago and then, not having the focus on combat, still had them. The fact that he had bought a ton of them at a discount when crafters and other groups were doing their best to clear their inventory had a lot to do with the fact that he still had boxes of these things sitting around at home. Silver-tipped stakes, entire drumfuls of holy water, pounds and pounds of earth transported from Transylvania and funeral homes, even a half-dozen coffins. In a warehouse, he still was trying to get rid of the entire factory run of UV-coated mirrored glass he'd picked up too. All kinds of random items once rumored to be useful or necessary. Or, in this case, finally useful again. The weapon sank into the wolf's chest like a hot knife through butter. Dram couldn't help but smile a little, watching as it went all the way in. A quick jerk of his arm broke the weakened end off, leaving the stump inside the chest before he scrambled out of the way of the weakly batting arms. Weak only in a sense, since those claws were sharp and took skin with them each time they connected. On his feet, Dram surveyed the damage. One side of his body was all torn up, hanging flaps of skin and muscle where the blows had ripped through his body without end. Blood dripped from it, slowly and steadily, even as the sound of screams and shouts generated from AI-run NPCs broke through the battle haze. A lot of damage. Luckily, Dram was not one of those realism-is-a-must fools, and he had his pain thresholds dialed all the way down, as far as they would allow him, really, which meant that while it was annoying for certain actions and made him clumsy, it wasn't debilitating to have his avatar all torn up. The werewolf struggled upright once, lunging for him. He skipped backwards, keeping out of the way, the player's other hand scrabbling for the tip of the stake. It tore into skin itself, even as the bleeding and staked debuff sapped the monster's energy. Cheat! Goddamn cheater! You mods! Report you! The werewolf coughed out. Dram stepped aside, watching as the body thrashed around for a few more seconds before it stopped. And then the body began to shrink, transforming into a man's. Then and only then did the vampire relax, scanning about him, catching sight of a variety of humans and other passers-by watching the scene. He sighed, realizing that there was going to be a lot more work involved in this night than he had expected. Damn masters. Even when he wasn't around, he was creating problems for Dram. Life as an information purveyor in Eternal Night was particularly simple. His job mostly involved talking to people, dealing with individuals and vampires who needed to get the scoop on others. All of that meant that it was his wide range of contacts, the spies and the other fangers who gave him his information. It also meant that while he rarely ever needed to make use of a cleaner, he definitely had their contacts. In Eternal Night, there were two ways that you could engage such services. There were a few in-person vampire avatars that were run by players who did the job. For the most part, they weren't particularly well respected since most of them just weren't online often enough to make them reliable. And while the system AI could and did run the business for them, their offline characters were also limited because of the very same hard-coded scripts that safeguarded characters from taking active part in violent situations and forcing a combative response when the player wasn't present. After all, no one wanted to log on and find themselves unable to act, as their character had been killed or was otherwise respawning. All of which meant that unless a situation was considered very clear, Such offline avatars were of little use, especially since cleaning situations were dynamic and often ripe for additional problems. Even though there were ways of extending the core AI script, expanding the options and scenarios that the avatars were allowed to interact within, there were still hard-coded limits, all of which really meant that for the most part it was NPCs that everyone went to when they needed to clean a scene. Dram was very much the same way, having contacted not one but two different groups to help him out with his predicament. The first cleaning crew were there to take away the body, chaining it down so that additional experimentation could be conducted on the corpse. They also washed down the body and removed any residue from the fight scene, whether it was Dram's own blood or the werewolf's. Standard procedures. Of course, Dram had made his way over to the transformed body and looted it beforehand, which was why he was standing over in one corner, hidden using shadow once more and going over the phone that he had extracted. Seriously, 9876 is not a password, he muttered, having finished trying to crack the phone. He'd tested the most common ones just in case, because, well, otherwise he'd have to do it in his mansion. Now, let's see what we have here. Quick snapshot of the phone contacts and a simple dongle to download all saved offline data to the USB first. That was easy enough and ensured that even if the phone was wiped later, he'd have some information on hand. Next. This name is familiar. Ashton. Last phone call. Incoming, too. Dram debated for a second before he shrugged and hit dial. Long seconds waiting for the phone call to answer. Idly, the vampire watched the second cleaning crew work. The second crew dealt with the squishier problems, such as the humans who had noticed the entire event along with all the various electronic, mobile, and digital recordings that had been taken. It was, thankfully, relatively constrained in Eternal Night, unlike in the real world. So long as you paid enough money or plugged in enough resources to the cleaning crew, and most players were prompted to use the right level, everything would be locked down. After all, the point of all of this wasn't to make life miserable for players, but to keep the overall atmosphere of the game intact. It made little sense to create a game about hidden overlords of the night and have the first idiot player break it all open. It made everyone's life simpler that there were basic cleaner services, while also making sense. In fact, Dram knew of at least a half-dozen major storylines that had run through nearly the same number of cities involving NPC cleaners and player-created incidents. If you constantly had vampires running around causing trouble, you definitely didn't want hundreds of recordings floating around the world, which was why major quests were involved in dispelling or disappearing such pieces of evidence. Even so, there was still about a half-dozen records that had to be scrubbed from the internet well before they became a problem. The faster you got them done, the cheaper and easier it was to contain the problem. This was going to be expensive. Yeah? It done? The voice over the phone replied. Ashton. That's how I know the name, Dram replied, shaking his head. The idiot Fanger from the club, the one who had threatened him. Now, why are you on this contact list? You! You're alive! Nah, pretty dead, like you, Dram said, drumming his fingers on his thigh. You're the one who sent him after me, huh? I'm not saying anything, panicked Ashton replied hurriedly. Okay. You can't... What? I said okay. You don't have to say anything to me. I got everything I needed when you answered the phone. Though... Dram trailed off, mind spinning. At least this answered how the quest had been generated. The question was, why are you working with the wares? And how? I told you, I'm not saying anything. Before Dram could answer, another voice, much thinner and in the background, hissed, Kill the call already, you idiot. Wait, Dram sighed, realizing the call had ended before he could prod for more information. Still, at least two of them know. He didn't recognize the second voice, but it certainly was fascinating that somehow the Fangers knew. Or this Ashton. Then again, on a meta level it makes sense. Aren't there a few series where the vampires and wares are friends? What was it, Fang and Claw? Or was that the sexy one? Dram muttered, staring up at the night sky. He'd been slacking on his supernatural fiction reading. It helped knowing the general meta. Sir? A voice, grovelly and low, took Dram out of his thoughts, and he focused on the blood servant, smiling thinly. Yes? "We have a few issues we need your help on," the NPC murmured. Rolling his eyes, Dram discarded the thoughts of Ashton. Later. Right now, he had a more immediate set of problems to handle. It seemed that the existence of the werewolf presence had thrown the routine NPC cleaner programs in disarray. Another clue, perhaps, dropped by the developers to begin the process of adding in the new expansion. Maybe. Or just bad coding. Sometimes it was hard to tell deliberate intention from lucky accident when you were on the outside. Either case, over the next few hours, Dram was forced to request help from his various sources to suppress any information about his most recent actions. He also took the opportunity to press upon them that he wanted any information on people who might be looking into him. Might as well kill two birds with one stone. Once it was all settled and he had organized a coroner to look over the body and run all the tests they could think of, daylight had begun to stream through the windows of his real-world apartment. His eyes had already begun to hurt, his body reminding him that it had other bodily needs. Even worse, the health and wellness system was already beeping at him, insisting that he had to log off. Annoying, especially since he paid for top-of-the-line hardware, but what could you do? After a number of others had managed to kill themselves staying indoors and plugged in for too long, the company had gotten even more stringent, making sure that anyone who even tried to bypass their safeguards was removed from the game entirely. They had no desire to face another lawsuit. Popping the helmet off, Dram rotated his neck and ran a hand through sweaty hair. He'd gotten a little worked up towards the end there, making calls and speaking with people. Back in the real world, he had to admit, the acrid stink of old sweat and excess adrenaline from the fight hung in his bedroom, mixing with the stale air to make him wrinkle his nose. Rolling off the bed, he limped over to the only window he had, propping it open to let the air circulate. Bouncing a little on his feet, Dram shook some blood back into his legs. A whole night's work, and he had a human body, some recordings, and almost definite knowledge of what the next update would contain. Now, the question was, how did he position himself, the knowledge he had gathered, and his allies for the upcoming update? And most importantly, what was it with the Fangers and the Wares? Were they really just playing out one of those shifter vampire romance books? Or was there something a little deeper going on? Had all this been happening under his nose to help balance the internal politics of the world and he had missed it? Or was this a one-off occurrence? Wandering into his kitchen, Dram popped open the fridge, searching through half-eaten takeout containers. Fried rice that smelled a little off? Garbage. Half-eaten burrito that, well, smelled okay, but nah. Back in the fridge. Oh, curry. That was always good. Not bothering with the rice, he grabbed a spoon and started eating the cold curry while leaning against the fridge, mind turning over his options. So, what did he have? A body, but currently the corpse looked like any other human male. The silver steak wasn't going to be particularly useful. Most things died from being staked. Unless the coroner came back with variant DNA records or something else, all he had was a series of blurry recordings and his own word. Even the digital recordings weren't completely foolproof. A series of stories about disappearing locations, again circumstantial. Some stories from Bloods who had weird feelings. And, of course, Ashton. Tossing the empty curry container aside, he wiped his mouth and grabbed a pop, breaking the seal on the drink as he considered his next steps. Overall, a lot more learnt than he had truly expected in a single day. So with morning would come another shift. Different players, different viewpoints. Perhaps it was time to let someone else take the reins of the investigation. Hunt down Ashton and his crew, burrow into Fangers' subculture. Figure out what the hell was going on. Most importantly, how they could benefit from all this information. Quaffing the pop and letting out a little belch, Dram grinned. He knew just the person. Walking over to his computer, humming to himself, he mentally began composing the email he was about to send. No reason to wait till he could log in to give his friend the heads up. All in all, maybe Masters wasn't the complete problem he thought he was. Though he was still going to charge the man double the next time he saw him. Getting cut up was never fun. The end. You have been listening to Blood Knowledge, written by Tao Wong, performed by Joe Hempel. Copyright 2022 by Tao Wong. Production copyright 2022 by Starlit Publishing.